October 17, 1943. Camp Forest,
a basement
Tennessee.
interrogation room in the village of
Cassino,
Cassino,
hissed as
Italy.
compressed air filled the hollow
The
form.
walls were damp stone that
For
smelled
men
of
guided
mildew
the
and old
inflation.
mortar.
Hands steadying
A
what
single
moments
electric
before had been
bulb
a
hung
collapsed
from a
heap
frayed
of
rubberized fabric
casting
weighing
harsh
less than
shadows
100
across the
pounds.
concrete floor. In 90 seconds,
Marie-Thérèse
it took
Marchand
shape.
sat at a wooden table
The turret
between
rose
two men who
first,
spoke
then
different
the hull,
languages
then
but
the
shared the
treads.
same exhaustion in their eyes.
From 20 feet away,
On
it
her
looked
left,
ridiculous.
an American intelligence
A
officer
balloon.
with a cigarette burning
A
down to
toy.
his knuckles. Something children
On her
might
right,
play with
a
at a
captured
county
German
fair.
sergeant with dried blood
From
crusting the
300
collar
yards
of
through
his
field
uniform.
glasses, it looked
She
like
was
an
26
M4
years old.
tank.
Private
Fluent in
Daniel
7
Tompkins
languages,
stood watching,
hands
and
shoved
already
deep in
tired
his
of
jacket
translating
pockets.
fear.
He
The
painted
American
signs
asked
for
the
questions
question
about
about
Wehrmacht
before the
troop
war.
movements north of the Gustav
Now
Line.
he painted unit insignia on
Marie-Thérèse
rubber.
translated it into
The
German,
absurdity
watching
hadn't
the
worn
sergeant's
off.
face for micro-expressions of recognition
200
or
men
deception.
worked in
practiced silence.
The German
inflating
replied
more
that he
tanks,
knew nothing,
positioning
that he
them
was just a
information,
medical orderly,
draping
that he had
camouflage
only
netting
been
to
trying to
suggest
save
crews
lives.
sleeping nearby. As she
They
translated
were
his
artists,
words back
mostly.
into English, she noticed
Fashion
something the American
designers.
officer missed.
Broadway said
The way the
decorators.
sergeant's voice softened when he
Men who
mentioned
understood
saving shadow
lives.
and perspective, and how
The way
the
his
human eye
hands
could be
trembled
fooled.
when he described pulling
The
wounded
question
men from
nobody
rubble.
could answer was whether German
He wasn't
eyes
lying
could be
about
fooled
being
the
a
same
man.
way. He was
Colonel
telling
Harry
the truth
Reid
about
about
trying to
trying to
preserve
preserve
life
life
in a
in
war
war
designed
his
to
boots
extinguish
crunching
it.
on gravel.
The American officer
commanded
lit another
real armor
cigarette
before
and
this
asked more
assignment.
questions. The 46th
Marie-Thérèse
Armored
translated.
Infantry Regiment. The German
Men in
answered.
steel and diesel fuel.
She translated again. Now he commanded rubber
This
and
went on
compressed
for
air
2
in a
hours.
slim hope that visual
in
deception
those
might
2
work in
hours,
modern warfare.
she
became something neither man
The
could
British
be.
claimed success in
She
North
became
Africa.
the bridge between their worlds. Dummy tanks had confused
The only
Rommel and
person
El
in the
Alamein
room
who understood both their
Fake
words
supply
and their
depots
silences
had
had drawn German bombers away
This
from
was
real
her war.
positions. Not
But
fought
North
with
Africa
weapons.
was desert.
Not one with
Open
territory.
terrain.
But
Long
conducted in the
sightlines.
liminal space between languages,
Normandy would be
where
different.
confession and interrogation
Villages.
blurred into something more human and more
Hedgerows.
terrible. Germans who spent
Marie-Thérèse
4 years
Marchand had
preparing
been born in
defenses,
Geneva to a
studying
Swiss
every
father
kilometer
and a
of
French
coastline,
mother.
photographing
Her
from the
childhood
air
had
had
been
been shaped by languages
If
the
the
way
deception
other
looked
children's were
fake,
shaped by
the
operation
playgrounds.
failed. French
If
if
it
it
looked
looked too real, German
German in
artillery
school.
would target it, and
Italian
Italian men
from her
had no
grandmother
armor
who had
fled
fled
Mussolini's
Mussolini's
early years. Just
English
imagination
from
and
her
her
father's
father's
business
business later when
associates.
punctured.
The
Spanish
unit
had a
Russian
designation,
and
and Polish acquired later
23rd
through private
headquarters
tutors and
special
an
troops.
insatiable appetite for
The
literature.
men called it something else.
By 1939,
The Ghost
she
Army.
could navigate the nuances
They'd
of
been
7
activated
languages
in
with the same
January.
ease most people reserve
No
for their
precedent.
native tongue.
No
She
training
understood
manual.
not just vocabulary
The
and
U.S.
grammar,
Army had
but
never
context
created a
and
unit
specifically
specifically
designed for
The
tactical
way
deception.
certain
words carried different
George
weight depending
Washington
on who
who
spoke
spoke
them. Spies and misinformation
The way
at Trenton
silence
could mean consent in
but
one language
systematic
and
visual
refusal in
in
another.
another.
Sonic and radio deception
war
as
broke
doctrine.
out,
She was studying
they were
linguistics
inventing
at the
it.
University of Geneva. Major Ralph Ingersoll
She had
pushed
plans
the
to become a
concept.
professor.
An advertising
spend her life
executive
analyzing
analyzing
the
the
evolution
evolution
of
of
Romance
romance
languages
military
or perhaps
intelligence
researching
researching
them.
Proto-Indo-European roots.
He'd
seen reconnaissance
But
photos from
war-consumed
British deception
plans
the way fire
operations.
consumed paper. Studied how Rommel's intelligence
1940,
officers
after
had been
France
systematically
fell in
misled
Switzerland's
about
neutrality
Allied
became
strength
an
and
island
position
in
in
an
an ocean of violence.
If the
Marie-Thérèse
British could do
made
it
a
in
decision.
Africa,
Americans
she
could
could
do it
not
in
fight.
France. Her country
Save
would not
lives
fight
through
illusion. But she could
Make the
speak. Enemy waste resources
And in a
attacking
war
that
those.
stretched across a continent where a
Recruitment
dozen
had been
languages
unusual.
collided in confusion and
They
bloodshed.
needed men who
the
could
ability
think
to
like
translate
enemies,
became its own
anticipate
kind of what
weapons.
observers would believe. She offered her services
Artists
to the
who
International
understood
Committee of the Red Cross. Sound engineers
They
who could fake
immediately
audio. Recognized her value. Radio operators
A
who could
multilingual
mimic
translator
communication
who could
patterns
work
so
in
precisely
prisoner of war
that German
camps,
direction
interrogation
finding and
centers,
track phantom
and
divisions.
field hospitals.
The unit's
Someone
average
who could
IQ measured
facilitate
119
communication
between armies that shared
higher
nothing
than most
except the
combat
determination to
divisions.
destroy each other. But intelligence
By
didn't guarantee
1943,
survival. She had worked in 7
Lieutenant
different
Colonel
locations
Clifford
across
Simmons
Italy.
ran the training.
She had
How to
translated for
inflate a
British
dummy
officers
tank in under 20
interrogating
minutes.
Italian prisoners. How to create
For
tire
American
tracks that
field
matched
commanders
real
armored
negotiating
vehicles.
with German deserters. How to string radio
For
antennas
French
at heights
resistance
that suggested
operatives to briefing
specific
unit
captured
types.
Gestapo agents. How to walk
And with
talk,
every translation,
and act like
she
soldiers
accumulated
accumulated something that no one
exist.
else in the war possessed. Deception wasn't just
She
visual. Accumulated the confessions
It was
of both
behavioral.
sides. Every
The American
American
soldiers
soldiers told
lied.
her about their fear. German intelligence
About lying
officers
awake
were
at
professionals.
night in
foxholes listening to
They
German
cross-referenced
artillery
signals
and
intercepts
intercepts
with
with aerial
aerial
would have their names
reconnaissance
with ground reports. About the smell of
One
their friends burning
consistency
inside
could unravel
tanks.
everything.
About
The
writing
equipment
letters
arrived
home
throughout
that said
February
everything was
and
fine
March.
when everything was absolutely
Inflatable
not
tanks
fine.
from Goodyear.
Each Sherman replica cost $85. A real tank cost $30,000. The Army ordered hundreds. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines.
The
May
German
3rd,
prisoners told her about their
1944.
exhaustion.
Camp Forest,
about fighting
Tennessee.
a war they no longer believed in.
The canvas
for
hissed as compressed air filled the hollow form.
About the horror of what
men
they had
guided
done
in
the name of the right,
hands steadying what moments
about
before
wanting
had been
nothing
a
more than
calamity
to
to
survive
long enough
enough
to
to
return
return
to
less than
families
100
who might not
pounds.
exist anymore. In 90 seconds,
The Italian
it took
civilians
told her about their
displacement.
The turret rose first, then
about
the hull,
watching their
then
villages
the become battlegrounds between
20
armies
feet
that
away.
treated their homes
It looked
as tactical
ridiculous.
positions rather than places where children had been born and grandparents had died. Something children
About
might
the
play
impossible
with at a
choice
fair.
between
starving under occupation or
300 yards
collaborating
through
with
field
whichever
glasses,
force happened
it
to
looked like
control
an
their
M4
M4 Sherman tank.
Marie-Thérèse
Private Daniel
Translator
Tompkins stood watching, hands shoved deep in his jacket Cassino and dozens of rooms
He
like it
painted
across
signs
for department stores
fear
before
into
the
words
war.
and
Words back into fear
Now
in
he
different
painted
languages.
unit
insignia on rubber. She became a repository
The absurdity
for the private
hadn't
thoughts
worn
of
off.
men who would never meet but
Around
who shared
him,
the same
200
fundamental
men
worked
terror.
in practiced silence.
And the terrible thing she
discovered was
this:
positioning them
when you
information,
stripped away the
draping
uniforms and the
camouflage
ideologies
to suggest
and the flags,
crews sleeping
everyone
nearby.
confessed the same things.
They were artists, mostly.
Everyone wanted the war to end.
Fashion designers. Everyone was afraid
Broadway
of dying.
set
decorators. Everyone carried guilt
who
about what they
understood
had
shadow
done or
and
failed to do,
perspective
and how the human eye could
Everyone
be fooled.
hoped that somewhere beyond
The question nobody could answer was whether German
existed.
eyes could be fooled the
But
same
she
way.
could never tell them that.
Colonel Harry Reeder
Could never
walked
say
among
to
the
the
American
inflatable
officers
Shermans
that the
his
German
boots
sergeant
crunching
across
on
the
gravel
table had the same nightmares.
He'd
commanded real armor
Could
before
never
this
tell the
assignment.
German
prisoner that the American
The 46th
interrogator
Armored
also woke
Infantry
up
Regiment.
screaming. Her
Men
role
in
was to
steel and
translate
diesel
the
fuel.
surface words, not
Now
the
he
underlying
commanded
humanity.
rubber
and compressed air and
because
the
if both sides understood
how
how
might
similar
work in
their
modern
fears were,
warfare. If both sides
the British
recognized
claimed
shared
success
exhaustion
in
in North
North
Africa, perhaps neither could
Dummy
continue
tanks
fighting.
had confused Rommel at
And
El
the war
Alamein.
needed translators more than
Fake
it needed
supply
compassion.
depots
had drawn German bombers away from real positions. Ended with the German sergeant
North
giving up the
Africa was
location
desert.
of a field hospital 7
Open
kilometers
terrain.
north. Long
The American
lines.
officer thanked Marie-Thérèse
Normandy
for
would
her
be
translation
translation and arranged for the
Villages.
prisoner to be transferred to a POW
Hedgerows.
camp near Naples. Germans who'd spent
After
4 years
both men
preparing
left,
defenses,
Marie-Thérèse
studying
remained
every
at the
kilometer
wooden
of
table for 20
minutes in
photographing
the photographing from the air daily. The light bulb swung if the slightly
deception
from
looked
ceiling
fake,
vibrations
the operation
caused by
failed.
distant artillery. If it looked too
Shadows
real,
moved
German
across the
artillery
damp
would
stone
target
walls
it,
like
and
ghosts.
Reeder's men had no armor. She thought
no
about
heavy
the German
weapons.
sergeant's hands trembling
Just
when he spoke
imagination
about
and
saving
rubber
tanks
tanks
that deflated when punctured.
She
thought about the American
unit
officers'
had a
eyes that
designation.
carried the same exhaustion
23rd
she had seen in 100 other
Special
men's
Troops.
eyes. The men
She thought
called
about
it something
something
else.
else.
Confessions she had translated,
The Ghost
and all the
Army.
humanity she had witnessed,
They'd been
and all the
activated
terrible
in
knowledge
January.
accumulating in her memory like
No
stones in a
precedent.
well. No
And she
training
understood
manual.
that her war was different
The
from
U.S.
everyone
Army
else's
had never
war.
created a unit
She was
specifically
fighting in a
designed for
space
tactical
between
deception,
languages
where the only casualty
George
was her own
Washington had
certainty.
used spies and
Where
misinformation
every
at Trenton.
translation forced her to see the
But
enemy as
systematic
human
visual,
and the allies as
sonic,
flawed, and the
radio
line
deception
between
is
right and
doctrine.
wrong as blurred as a
They
watercolor
were
in
inventing
rain.
it.
This
Major
was the
Ralph
problem
Ingersoll
she could
had
not
pushed
solve.
the concept.
This was the
An
burden she
advertising
carried into
executive
every
in civilian
interrogation
life.
room, now assigned to
She
military
was the woman who
intelligence
heard
in
confessions
from both sides
He'd
of the war.
seen reconnaissance photos
And the
from
more
British
she
deception
heard, the less she
operations.
understood what any of it
Studied
meant.
how
Rommel's intelligence officers had been systematically misled about Allied strength and positions. If the British could do it in Africa, Americans could do it in France. Save lives through illusion. Make the enemy waste resources attacking ghosts. Recruitment had been unusual. They needed men who could think like enemies, anticipate what observers would believe. Artists who understood lighting. Sound engineers who could fake audio. Radio operators who could mimic communication patterns so precisely that German direction-finding units would track phantom divisions. The unit's average IQ measured 119. Higher than most combat divisions. But intelligence didn't guarantee survival. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simmons ran the training. How to inflate a dummy tank in under 20 minutes. How to create tire tracks that matched real armored vehicles. How to string radio antennas at heights that suggested specific unit types. How to walk, talk, and act like soldiers from divisions that didn't exist. Deception wasn't just visual. It was behavioral. Every detail had to align. German intelligence officers were professionals. They cross-referenced signals intercepts with aerial reconnaissance with ground reports. One inconsistency could unravel everything. The equipment arrived throughout February and March. Inflatable tanks from Goodyear. Each Sherman replica cost $85. A real tank cost $30,000. The Army ordered hundreds. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines. January 1944. An American field hospital outside Anzio. The canvas hissed as compressed air filled the hollow for a
form.
captured German lieutenant
For
who
men
was
guided
recovering
the
from
inflation
wounds sustained
and
during the
steadying
Allied
what
landing.
moments before had been a
The
collapsed heap of
lieutenant's name was
rubberized
Klaus
fabric
Weber,
weighing less than 100 pounds.
23 years old.
In 90 seconds,
An engineering
it took
student
shape.
from Munich before the war.
The turret rose first,
Shrapnel
then the
had
hull,
torn through
then
his
the
left
treads.
shoulder and collapsed one
From
lung.
20 feet away,
American
it looked
doctors
ridiculous.
had saved his life with the same
balloon.
skill and dedication they applied to their own wounded. Something children
When
might play with
Marie-Thérèse
at a
entered
county
the
recovery
fair,
tent. She found
from
Lieutenant
300
Weber
yards
propped
through
against
field
pillows,
glasses,
his chest
looked
wrapped
like
in
an
bandages,
M4 Sherman
morphine
tank.
making his pupils large
Private
and
Daniel
unfocused.
Tompkins stood watching.
An
American
American major
major
stood
in his
beside
jacket
the cock with a
pockets.
notebook and questions
He
about
painted
German
signs
defense
for
department
department
stores
stores
before the
beachhead.
war. She
Now
introduced
he painted
herself
unit
unit
German.
insignia on rubber, explained that she
The
would translate
absurdity
questions
hadn't
from
worn
the
off.
American officer. Around him, asked if he
200 men
understood
worked
and
in
if he was
practiced
comfortable
silence,
enough to speak.
inflating more tanks.
Klaus Weber
positioning
looked
them
at her with those
information,
morphine-dilated
draping
eyes
camouflage
and said
netting
something she
suggests
would
never
never
forget.
sleeping nearby. I am
They
comfortable
were
dying,
artists,
he said in
mostly.
German.
Fashion
I stopped being
designers.
comfortable living 2 years
Broadway
ago.
set decorators.
She translated this for
Men
the
who
American
understood
major
shadow
as,
and
he is
perspective and how
experiencing
the
some
human eye could be
discomfort
fooled.
but is capable of answering
The
questions.
question nobody could answer was
The
whether German
interrogation
eyes could be
proceeded.
fooled the same way.
The major asked about
Colonel
German
Harry Reeder
reinforcements.
walked among the inflatable Shermans.
Weber provided
his boots
vague
crunching
answers
on
that
gravel.
contained just enough truth to be
He
credible
commanded
and just
real
enough
armor
omission
before
to
this
protect his
assignment.
former comrades. The 46th Armored
Marie-Thérèse
Infantry translated
translated
each exchange,
men and
maintaining the
steel and
professional
diesel
distance
fuel.
that her role required.
Now he commanded rubber
But
and
something had
compressed air
shifted and a slim hope that visual
That single
deception might
sentence,
work in
I
modern
stopped
warfare.
being comfortable living 2 years
The British
ago,
claimed
had
success
opened a
in
door
North
she could
Africa.
not close.
Dummy tanks
After
had
the
confused
American
Rommel
major
had
finished his
Alaman
questions
and left the tent.
Fake supply
Marie-Thérèse
depots
had
remained.
drawn German bombers away
She should
from
have
real
departed
positions.
immediately.
But North
Her job
Africa
was
was
translation,
desert, not conversation.
open terrain.
But she
Long
stayed.
sight lines.
And Klaus Weber,
Normandy would be
alone in
different.
enemy hands with morphine
Villages.
loosening his tongue, began
Hedgerows.
to confess. Germans
told
who'd
her
spent
about being
4 years
conscripted in
preparing
1941,
defenses, studying every kilometer
about
of
believing in
coastline,
Germany's destiny
photographing
because
from the
everyone
air
around
daily.
him believed it and
If
questioning
the
such
deception
things
looked
could get you
fake,
arrested.
the operation failed.
About his first deployment
If it
to the
looked
Eastern
too real,
Front where he had
German
watched his
artillery
engineering
would target
unit
it,
build bridges
and Reader's
across
men
Russian
had no
rivers
armor,
while villages
no heavy
burned on
weapons.
both horizons.
Just
He
imagination
told
and
her
about
about
the
the
things
things
he had
deflated
done
on
to
punishment.
civilians. The unit
Not
had
by
a designation.
designation.
20
He
third
emphasized
headquarters
that.
special troops, but by other
The
soldiers.
men called it something else.
By SS units that
The
moved
Ghost
through
Army.
occupied territories
They'd
like
been
locusts
activated
through
in
wheat
January.
fields.
No
About the
precedent.
impossibility of objecting
No
without
training
being labeled
manual.
a traitor or worse.
The U.S. Army had
He
never
told her about
created
the
a
day
unit
his unit
specifically
executed
designed for
Soviet
tactical
partisans at a
deception.
village whose name he could
George
no longer
Washington
remember.
had used spies and
15
misinformation
men and 3
Trenton.
women lined up against
But
a schoolhouse
systematic
wall.
visual,
sonic,
he had
and
been
radio
ordered to
deception
photograph
as the
doctrine.
execution for military
They were
records.
inventing it.
Had stood
Major
20
Ralph
feet away
Ingersoll
with a
had
camera
pushed the
while machine
concept.
guns performed their function. An advertising executive in
took the
civilian
pictures,
life,
Klaus
now
said in
assigned
German.
to military intelligence
I
in
developed
London.
them.
He'd
I
seen
filed them.
reconnaissance photos from
And
British
then I went to
deception
dinner and
operations,
ate potato soup and
played
studied
cards with
how
the other
Rommel's
engineers.
intelligence officers had been
He looked at her
systematically
with those
misled
dilated
about
Allied
eyes.
strength and positions.
How does a person do that?
If the British could do it
How
in
does a
Africa,
person witness
Americans
murder and
could
then
do
eat
it in
soup?
France.
Marie-Thérèse
Saved
had
lives
no
through
answer.
illusion. She was
Make
the enemy
translator.
waste resources attacking
She dealt
ghosts.
in words,
not absolution.
Recruitment had been unusual.
Klaus continued. They needed men who could
He
think like
described his
enemies,
growing disillusionment.
anticipate what observers would
The
believe.
way propaganda dissolved when
Artists who
confronted with
understood
reality.
reality. The
Sound
way
noble
engineers
rhetoric
who could
about
fake
defending
audio.
the
fatherland sounded hollow
Radio
after you had
operators
watched
who
enough
could mimic
people die for
communication
it.
patterns so precisely
The way
that
survival
German
became
direction
its own
finding units would
ideology,
track phantom
separate
divisions.
from whatever cause had started
The unit's
war.
average IQ measured
Do you know what I pray
119.
for? He asked her.
Higher than most combat
I don't
divisions.
pray for victory. But intelligence
pray
didn't
for
guarantee
Germany.
survival. I pray that I die
Lieutenant
before
Colonel
I have to
Clifford
kill
Simmons
anyone.
ran the training.
That is my
How
greatest
to
fear
inflate
now.
a dummy tank in under
Not
20
death.
minutes. How to create
Participation.
tire tracks that match
She
real
should have
armored
left the
vehicles.
tent.
How
Should
to
have closed this
radio
conversation
and
and
heights
returned
that
to her
suggested
professional
specific
duties.
unit types.
But something
How to
Klaus said
walk,
had resonated
talk,
with something
and act
she had
like
been
soldiers
feeling
for
from
months.
divisions that didn't exist.
The exhaustion of carrying
Deception
both
wasn't
sides
just
humanity.
visual. The
It was
moral weight of
behavioral.
understanding. Every detail
American
had to align.
soldiers say similar things.
German
She told him
intelligence
in
officers
German.
were professionals, breaking her own rule. They cross-referenced signals
Revealing
intercepts
information
with
that
aerial
crossed the
reconnaissance
boundaries
with
of
ground
her role.
reports. Klaus
One
stared at her.
inconsistency
Could unravel
They do.
everything. They fear the same
equipment
things survive throughout February and March. They carry the same guilt. Inflatable tanks from Goodyear. They want the war to end for the same reasons. Each Sherman replica cost $85. A real tank cost $30,000. The army ordered hundreds. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Camp Florence, Tennessee, moved in the cold January wind. The canvas hissed as compressed air filled the hollow floor. An ambulance was arriving with men guided the inflation, The
Hand
war
steadying
continued
what its
moments
work
regardless
before
of
had
their
been a
conversation.
collapsed heap of rubberized fabric weighing
Then why
less
do we
than
fight?
100 pounds? Klaus asked.
In 90 seconds,
It was
took
the
shape.
question Marie-Thérèse had been
The
avoiding
turret
for
rose
2
first,
years, then the hull,
the
then
question
the
that
treads.
grew heavier with every
From 20
interrogation
feet
she
away,
translated.
it looked ridiculous.
If both sides
A
feared the
balloon,
same things and wanted the
a
same
toy,
end and carried the same guilt,
something children
what
might
exactly
play
was
at
the
a
war
county fair?
accomplishing?
But she had
300
no
yards
answer.
through field glasses,
Because
it looked
answering
like
would
an
require
M4
choosing
Sherman
a side.
tank.
Private
And the curse
Daniel
of the
the Tompkins
translator
stood
was that
watching,
she could not
hands
choose.
shoved deep in his jacket
She
pockets.
existed in the space between
He
sides,
painted signs
and that
for
space
department
was
stores
growing
before
larger
the
and
war.
more unbearable with each
Now he
passing
painted
month.
unit insignia on
She
rubber.
visited Klaus Weber
The
3 more
absurdity
times
hadn't
during his
worn off.
recovery at the field hospital.
Around him, 200
never
men
with
worked
official
in practiced
sanction,
silence,
inflating
never as
more
part of her
tanks,
translation
positioning them
duties.
information,
She
draping
would come after
camouflage netting
hours,
to suggest
sit
crews
beside his
sleeping
cot,
nearby,
and they would talk.
They were artists,
Not interrogation.
fashion
Not
intelligence
intelligence
gathering.
Broadway
Just
set
2 people
decorators.
existing in a war neither of
Men
them had
who
chosen
understood
and
shadow
neither could
and
escape.
perspective and how the
He
human eye
told
could
her
be
about
fooled.
his family. The
A
question
father
nobody
who
could
owned
answer
a
was whether
bookshop in
German
Munich.
eyes could be fooled the
A
same
mother
way.
who taught piano.
Colonel Harry Reeder
A younger
walked among
sister
the
who
inflatable
wanted to become a
Shermans,
doctor.
his boots crunching on
He
gravel.
had not heard from them in 8
He'd
months.
commanded real armor before
Did
this
not know
assignment.
if they had survived the Allied
the
bombing
46th
raids.
Armored Infantry Regiment.
Did not know if his letters
Men
were
in
reaching
steel
him.
and diesel fuel.
She told him about
Now
Geneva.
he commanded rubber and compressed
About her
air
education.
and the slim hope that visual
About the
deception might
strange
work in
isolation
modern
of being
warfare.
Swiss in a continent
The
at war.
British claimed success in
About
North
watching
Africa.
all the countries around her
Dummy
destroy
tanks had
themselves
confused
while Rommel
formation
and El
maintained its
Alamein.
neutral distance.
Fake supply
But you are
depots had
not
drawn
neutral,
German bombers
Klaus
away
observed.
from real positions.
You translate
But
for the
North
Allies.
Africa was desert.
I translate for
Open
whoever
terrain.
needs translation. She
Long
corrected.
sight lines.
I've worked in
Normandy
German
would be
prison
different.
camps and Allied interrogation
Villages.
centers.
Hedgerows.
I translate in all directions.
Germans who'd spent 4
But
years
you must
preparing
have preference.
defenses, studying every
You must
kilometer
believe
of
one
coastline,
side is right.
photographing from the air daily.
She considered his question.
If the deception looked
It was
fake,
the same
the
question
operation
she asked
failed.
herself in empty rooms
If it
after
looked too
interrogations
real,
ended.
German artillery would
Did
target
she
it,
believe in
and
Allied
Reeder's men
victory?
had no armor,
In
no
German
heavy
defeats.
weapons.
In
Just
the moral
imagination
superiority
and
of
rubber
democracy
tanks that
over
deflated when
fascism.
punctured.
I believe
The
both
units had a
sides are
designation.
human, she finally answered.
23rd Headquarters
And
Special
I believe
Troops.
humans should not do what
The
this
men
war
called
makes
it
them
something
do.
else.
Klaus
The
smiled
Ghost Army.
sadly.
They've
That
been
is not a
activated
political
in January.
position. That
No
is just
precedent.
grief. No
He was
training
right.
manual. And in that
The
moment
U.S.
of
Army had
recognition,
never created a
Marie-Thérèse
unit
felt
specifically
something
designed
inside
for
her
tactical
transform.
deception.
She had been trying
George
to maintain
Washington had
professional
used spies
detachment
and misinformation at
to
Trenton.
be the neutral conduit for
But
other
systematic
people's
visual,
words,
sonic,
to
and radio
exist in the
deception
space
as
between
doctrine.
languages without
They
judgment
were
or
inventing
preference.
it.
Major
But Klaus
Ralph
Weber
Weber
with his
morphine
the
wide
concept.
eyes and his confession about
An
photographing
advertising
executives
executive
in
in
civilian
civilian
life
life,
to have to
now
kill had
assigned
shown
to
her the
military
impossibility of
intelligence
her
in
position.
London.
There
He'd
was no
seen
such
reconnaissance
thing as
photos
neutral
from British
translation.
deception operations.
Every word she chose,
Studied how
every
Rommel's
nuance she
intelligence
conveyed or
officers
omitted,
had been
every
systematically
silence she
misled
allowed
about
to
Allied
exist
strength
contained
and
judgments.
She
If the
was not
British
a
could
bridge
do it in
between
Africa,
worlds.
Americans could do it
She
in
was a
France.
person forced to choose which
Save
world to
lives through
prioritize
illusion.
with every sentence she
Make
translated.
the enemy waste resources
And the weight of
attacking
those
ghosts.
choices was accumulating into something
Recruitment
she
had
could
been
no
unusual.
longer carry.
They needed
Klaus
men
Weber
who
was
could think
transferred
like
to a
enemies,
POW camp
anticipate
in
what
North
observers
Africa
would
6
believe.
days after their final
Artists
conversation.
who understood lighting.
She never saw him
Sound
again.
engineers who could fake
Never
audio.
knew if he survived the war
Radio
or if he made it
operators who
back
could
to
mimic
Munich to see if his
communication
family's
patterns so
bookshop still
precisely
stood.
that German direction-finding
But his
units would
question
track
remained.
phantom divisions. Then why do we
The
fight?
unit's average IQ
And her
measured
inability to
119,
answer it marked the moment her
higher than
transformation
most
began.
combat divisions.
The moment she
But
stopped being
intelligence
just a
didn't
translator
guarantee
and became
survival.
something else. Lieutenant
A
Colonel
witness.
Clifford Simmons ran the
A
training.
repository for
How to
confessions.
inflate a dummy tank in
A
under
woman
20
who
minutes.
understood too much to maintain
How
the
to create
comfortable
tire
distance
tracks
that
that
ignorance
matched real
allowed.
armored vehicles.
The war was changing
How to
her in
string
ways she
radio
could not
antennas at
articulate.
heights that suggested specific
Making her
unit
see
types.
things she could not unsee.
How to walk, talk,
Teaching her
and
truths
act
she
like
wished she
soldiers
did
from
not know.
divisions that didn't exist.
And the most terrible truth
Deception
was this:
wasn't just
everyone
visual.
was right and everyone was
It was
wrong,
behavioral.
and the translator was the
Every
only
detail
person who
had
had
to
to live
align.
with that contradiction.
German intelligence officers were professionals. They cross-referenced signals intercepts with aerial reconnaissance with ground reports. One inconsistency could unravel everything. The equipment arrived throughout February and March. Inflatable tanks from Goodyear. Each Sherman replica cost $85. A real tank cost $30,000. The Army ordered hundreds. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines. May
March
3, 1944. A makeshift
Camp
interrogation
Forest,
center
Tennessee.
in a requisitioned villa outside
The canvas
Rome.
hissed as compressed air
Marie-Thérèse
filled the hollow
translated
form.
for a captured SS
The men
officer
guided
who
the
refused
inflation,
to speak
hand
except in
steadying
carefully
what moments
constructed
before
lies
had been a
designed to
collapsed
waste
heap of
American
rubberized
intelligence
fabric
weighing
resources.
less than 100 pounds.
His name was Hopstern.
In
For
90
Friedrich
seconds,
Kessler.
it took shape. Career SS,
The turret
true
rose
believer.
first, then the hull,
He answered
then
every
the treads.
question with the kind of fanatical
From 20
precision
feet
that
away,
revealed
it
nothing
looked
while appearing
ridiculous.
cooperative. A balloon.
His eyes never wavered.
A toy. His voice
Something
never
children might
hesitated.
play with at a county fair.
He was a man who had found
From
certainty
300
in
yards
ideology
through field
and had never
glasses,
suffered the
it
doubt
looked
that
like an
plagued
M4
lesser
Sherman
soldiers.
tank.
Private
Marie-Thérèse
Daniel
across
Kaufman
from
stood
stood
translated his answers
shoved
with
deep in
mechanical
his
accuracy.
jacket pockets.
She had
He
encountered
painted
his signs
signs
for
before.
department stores before
The
the ones
war.
who truly believed. Now he painted unit
Who saw the
insignia
war
on
as a
rubber.
crusade and themselves
The
as
absurdity
crusaders.
hadn't worn off. Who carried no doubt
Around
and
him,
therefore no
200
guilt.
men worked in practice.
They were
silence,
easier to hate
inflating
than men
more
like
tanks,
Klaus Weber, positioning them in
but
formation,
also more
draping
difficult to
camouflage
understand.
men to suggest crews
The
sleeping
American
nearby.
interrogator, a
They
colonel
were
named
artists,
Patterson, who had
mostly.
lost his temper after 2
Fashion
hours of
designers.
circular answers,
Finally
finally
dismissed
dismissed
the
the
prisoner
prisoners
and turned to Marie-Thérèse with
men who
exhausted
understood
frustration.
shadow and perspective and
What
how
the hell
human
is
eye
wrong
could
with
be
these
fooled.
people? The
Patterson
question
nobody
asked in
could
English
answer
was whether German eyes
How
could
can they
be
believe
fooled the
this
same
shit?
way.
Colonel
Marie-Thérèse
Harry
had
Reader
translated
walked among the
variations of
inflatable
this question
Shermans,
100
his
times.
boots crunching on gravel.
American and British
He
officers
commanded
constantly
real armor
asked
before
how
this
German
assignment.
soldiers could follow Hitler.
The 46th Armored
How they
Infantry
could participate
Regiment.
in atrocities.
Men in steel and
How
diesel
they could
fuel.
maintain faith in a cause
Now
so
he commanded
obviously
rubber and
doomed and
compressed
morally
air and the
bankrupt.
slim hope that visual
And she
deception
always
might work
gave the
in
same
modern
diplomatic
warfare.
answer. The British claim
Ideology
success
creates
in North
powerful
Africa.
certainty.
Dummy
But
tanks had
Patterson
confused
pressed
Rommel at El Alamein.
You speak their language.
Fake supply depots
You
had
talk
drawn
to them
German
when we're
bombers
not
away
around.
from real positions.
What do they actually say?
But North Africa was desert.
What do they actually believe?
Open terrain. It was a dangerous
Long
question.
sight lines.
Because answering
Normandy
honestly
would be
would mean
different.
revealing that she sometimes
Villages.
spoke to prisoners outside of
Hedgerows.
official interrogations.
Germans who'd spent
Would
4
mean
years
admitting that
preparing
she accumulated
defenses,
knowledge
studying
beyond
every
what she
kilometer of
translated in
coastline,
these rooms.
photographing from the air
They
daily.
believe they are defending their
If the
homeland.
deception
She
looked
said
fake,
carefully. The operation failed.
They believe the alternative
If
is
it
worse
looked
than
too
fighting.
real, German artillery
The
would
alternative
target
to
it,
losing
and
is worse
Reader's
than
men
this.
had no armor, no
Patterson
heavy weapons.
gestured vaguely toward the window.
Just
where the
imagination
sound
and
distant
rubber tanks
artillery
that
provided
provided constant
puncture.
percussion. The unit
Worse
had
than
a
the slaughter.
designation. Marie-Thérèse thought about
Headquarters
Klaus
special
Weber's
troops.
confession about
The
photographing
men called it
executions.
something else.
About the German
ghost
sergeant
army.
in Cassino who
They'd
trembled when
been
discussing
activated in
saving
January.
lives.
No
About the
precedent.
SS officer who had just
No
left this
training
room
manual.
carrying absolute conviction
The
like
U.S.
armor.
Army had never created
For
a
some
unit
of them,
specifically
she said
designed
slowly,
for tactical
believing
deception.
they are right is the only
George
thing that allows
Washington
them to
had
function.
used spies and misinformation
If they
at
stopped
Trenton.
believing, they would have
But
to confront
systematic
what they have
visual,
done.
sonic, and
And
radio
that
deception
confrontation
is
would
doctrine.
destroy them. They were inventing
Patterson
it.
stared at her.
Major Ralph Ingersoll
Jesus
had
Christ.
pushed the concept.
You sound like you
An
sympathize
advertising
with them.
executive in civilian
Did
life,
she?
now assigned to
That was the
military
question that
intelligence
haunted
in
her
London.
increasingly sleepless
He'd
nights.
seen reconnaissance photos
Did
from
understanding
British
equal
deception
sympathy?
operations. Did translation
Studying how
require
Rommel's
empathy?
intelligence officers had
And
been
if so,
systematically
how much
misled
empathy
about
before
Allied
you
strength
crossed
and
some
positions?
invisible line from neutral observer
If the
to
British could
collaborator?
do it in Africa, Americans could
sympathize
do it
with
in
everyone,
France.
she finally answered.
Save lives through illusion.
That is the problem. Make the enemy
Patterson
waste resources
softened.
attacking ghosts. You've been doing this too long.
Recruitment had been unusual.
He was right. They needed
She
men
had been
who could
doing
think
this
like
too
enemies, anticipate
3
what
years of
observers would
translating
believe. Confessions from both
Artists
sides.
who understood lighting.
3 years of accumulating
Sound
other
engineers
people's
who could
guilt
fake
and
audio.
fear and doubt. Radio
3
operators
years
who
of
could
carrying
mimic
the weight of
communication
understanding
patterns
that
so
no one else
precisely
wanted
that
to
German
bear.
direction-finding units
That
would
night,
track phantom
Marie-Thérèse
divisions.
returned to her small
The
room in
unit's
the
average
requisition
IQ
villa and
measured
did something she had
119,
avoided throughout the entire
higher
war.
than most combat divisions.
She wrote in her journal not as a
but
translator,
intelligence didn't
but as
guarantee
herself.
survival. Not recording
Lieutenant
what others
Colonel
said,
Clifford
but
Simmons
expressing
ran the
what she
training.
felt. How to
The entry
inflate a dummy
began,
tank
I
in
no
under
longer
20
know
minutes.
which side I serve.
How to create
I
tire
translate
tracks
for
that
the
matched
Allies,
real armored
but I
vehicles.
understand the Germans.
How to string radio
facilitated
antennas and heights that
interrogations
suggest
that extract
specific
information
unit
used to
types.
kill German soldiers.
How to walk,
but I carry
talk,
confessions from
and
those
act
same
like
soldiers
soldiers
in my
from
memories
divisions
like
that
personal
didn't
burdens.
exist.
Where does
Deception
that leave
wasn't
me?
just visual. She continued
It was
writing for
behavioral.
2 hours. Every detail
Filling
had
pages
to
with
align.
thoughts
she had never spoken
German
aloud.
intelligence officers were
The terrible
professionals.
sameness she saw in all
They
soldiers
cross-referenced
regardless
signals,
of uniform.
intercepts with aerial
The way
reconnaissance
fear
with ground
tasted
reports.
identical in every language. One inconsistency
The
could
way guilt
unravel
accumulated
everything.
in the same
The
psychological
technological
equipment
spaces
arrived
whether
throughout
person
February
carrying
and
it
March.
fought for democracy or
Inflatable
dictatorship.
tanks from Goodyear.
She wrote about the moral
Each Sherman
exhaustion of
replica
being the
cost
only person who
$85.
understood both narratives.
A real tank cost
Of seeing the
$30,000.
justified anger of Allied
The
soldiers
Army
who
ordered
fought
hundreds.
against fascism while
They came with
simultaneously
hand
hearing
pumps
the desperate
initially,
survival
until
instinct
someone
of German
realized
soldiers
inflation
who just
took
wanted to
too
go
long.
home. Then
Of
knowing that
compressors
both
arrived.
truths existed
Portable
simultaneously
units
and that
mounted on
translating
jeeps.
one did not negate the other, loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines. The
May 3rd,
consequence of her position was
1944.
becoming clear. Camp Forest,
She was not
Tennessee.
building bridges between sides.
The canvas hissed as compressed
She was
air
being
filled
torn
the hollow
apart by the
form.
tension between them.
For men guided the
In
inflation,
April,
she
hand
translated
steadying
what
for
moments
French
before had been a
resistance
collapsed heap of
captured a
rubberized
German
fabric
intelligence
weighing less than
officer
100
near
pounds.
Lyons.
The
In 90
interrogation
seconds,
took place
it
in a
took
cellar
shape.
that smelled of wine
The
gone to
turret
vinegar.
rose first,
Then the hull,
French operative
then the
asked
treads.
questions with the kind of personal
20
hatred
feet
that
away,
came from
it
4
looked
years of
ridiculous.
occupation.
A balloon.
The German officer answered
A
with the
toy.
mechanical efficiency of a
Something
man
children
who knew
might
he was
play with
already
at a
dead.
county fair.
Marie-Thérèse
From 300
yards
between
through
them,
field
maintaining
glasses,
her professional
it looked like an
distance.
M4 Sherman tank.
But afterward,
the French
Private
operative
Daniel
pulled her
Tompkins
aside.
stood watching, hands
"You
shoved
translate
deep in
his words
jacket
too
pockets.
gently," he said in French.
He painted signs for
You
department
removed the
stores
arrogance
before
from
the
his
war.
voice.
Now
It
he
was
painted
true.
unit insignia on rubber.
She had been softening tones,
The absurdity
smoothing
hadn't
rough
worn
edges,
off.
making confessions
Around
more
him,
palatable.
200 men worked in
Not
practiced
consciously,
silence,
inflating
but
more
as an
tanks,
instinctive attempt
positioning
to
them
preserve some
information,
humanity in
draping
exchanges
camouflage
designed to
netting
strip it
suggest
away.
crews sleeping nearby.
I translate the content.
They were
she
artists,
replied.
mostly.
Not the effect.
Fashion designers.
Content without
Broadway
effect is
set
incomplete
decorators.
translation. Men who
You make
understood
them sound
shadow
more
and
human than
perspective
they
and
are.
how the human eye could be
But
fooled.
that was the problem.
The question nobody
were
could
human.
answer was whether German eyes
The German
could be fooled
officer
the
with
same
his
way.
mechanical answers was human.
Colonel Harry Reeder walked
The
among the
SS
inflatable
captain
with
with
his
his
fanatical
his
boots
certainty was
crunching
human.
on gravel.
Klaus Weber with his
commanded
morphine
real armor
confessions
before
was
this
human.
assignment. Understanding
The
that did
46th
not
Armored
excuse their
Infantry
choices
Regiment.
or negate their crimes.
Men in steel and
But
diesel
it complicated the simple narratives
Now
that
he
war
commanded
required.
rubber and compressed air,
The
and
French
slim
operative
hope that
left
visual
with his
deception
prisoner.
might work in modern warfare.
Marie-Thérèse remained in a cellar
The British
that smelled
claimed
of vinegar.
success in North Africa.
She thought about softening
Dummy tanks had
translations,
confused Rommel at El Alamein.
about removing arrogance and
Fake
hatred
supply
and fear from
depots
voices
had drawn
that
German
carried all
bombers
three.
away from real positions.
About the impossible task of
North Africa
translating
was
truth
desert.
without translating the
Open
feeling that
terrain.
gave truth its power.
Long sight lines.
She was changing the war in small
Normandy would be
ways with
different.
every choice she made.
Villages.
Making enemies sound
Hedgerows.
more reasonable.
Germans
Making
spent 4
confessions
years
more
preparing
sympathetic.
defenses, studying
Building
every kilometer
understanding
of
that
coastline,
perhaps should not exist
photographing
between
from
people
people
trying
trying
to
to kill each other.
If the deception
Was this
looked fake,
betrayal? The operation
or
failed.
was this the only ethical
If it
response
looked
to
too
horror?
real, German artillery
By
would
summer
target it,
1944,
and Reeder's men
as
had
Allied
no armor,
forces
no
pushed
heavy
northward
weapons.
through Italy and prepared
Just
for the invasion
imagination
of
and
France,
rubber tanks that
Marie-Thérèse
deflated
had translated
when
for over 300
The
interrogations.
unit had a designation.
She had heard confessions
23rd
from
Wehrmacht
Wehrmacht
special
soldiers and
troops.
SS officers and
The
Italian
men called it
fascists
something
and German
else.
deserters and prisoners
The
of
ghost
every
army.
rank and ideology. They'd been activated
And the
in
accumulation
January.
of those confessions had
No
created
created
a
a
burden she could no longer
No
ignore.
training manual. She carried the
The
private
U.S.
thoughts
Army
of men
had never
from both
created a
sides.
unit specifically designed
She knew
for
their
tactical
fears and their
deception.
guilt and their doubts.
George Washington had
She
used
understood
spies
their
and
humanity
misinformation
in
at
ways
Trenton.
that made simple moral judgments
But systematic
impossible.
visual, sonic,
This was
and
the
radio
consequence
deception
of
as
being the
doctrine.
translator. They were inventing
This was
it.
what happened when you heard confessions
Major Ralph
from both
Ingersoll
sides
had
of the
pushed
war.
the concept.
You became the
An
keeper of
advertising
truths that
executive in
contradicted each
civilian
other.
life, now assigned to
carried
military
knowledge that made
intelligence
action
in London.
difficult and judgment impossible.
He'd seen reconnaissance
And
photos
you
from
existed
British
in a
deception
space between
operations
worlds where neither side fully
studied
trusted
how
you and
Rommel's
where you could no
intelligence
longer fully
officers
trust
had been
yourself.
systematically misled about
The burden
Allied
was
strength
crushing
and
her.
positions. And she had
If the
no one
British
to
could do it
confess
in
to.
Africa, Americans
Because who
could do it in
translates for the
France.
translator? Save lives through illusion. Make the enemy waste resources attacking ghosts. Recruitment had been unusual. They needed men who could think like enemies, anticipate what observers would believe. Artists who understood lighting. Sound engineers who could fake audio. Radio operators who could mimic communication patterns so precisely that German direction-finding units would track phantom divisions. The unit's average IQ measured 119. Higher than most combat divisions. But intelligence didn't guarantee survival. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simmons ran the training. How to inflate a dummy tank in under 20 minutes. How to create tire tracks that matched real armored vehicles. How to string radio antennas at heights that suggested specific unit types. How to walk, talk, and act like soldiers from divisions that didn't exist. Deception wasn't just visual. It was behavioral. Every detail had to align. German intelligence officers were professionals. They cross-referenced signals intercepts with aerial reconnaissance with ground reports. One inconsistency could unravel everything. The equipment arrived throughout February and March. Inflatable tanks from Goodyear. Each Sherman replica cost $85. A real tank cost $30,000. The Army ordered hundreds. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines. August 1944. A former
Camp
schoolhouse
Forest,
in Florence,
Tennessee,
now serving as an
the
Allied
canvas
interrogation
hissed as compressed
center.
air filled the hollow floor.
Marie-Thérèse was asked to translate
guided
for a German
prisoner
who had information about defensive positions along the Gothic line in the Apennine weighing less than 100 pounds. The prisoner was a 19-year-old private named Peter Hoffman. The
He had been
turret rose
captured
first,
during a skirmish
then the hull,
outside
then the
Pistoia.
treads. A bullet
From
had
20
grazed
feet
his
away,
skull, leaving him with a
ridiculous.
concussion and a bandage wrapped
balloon.
around his head that made him look like a
toy.
child playing soldier. Something children might
He was
play with at a
terrified.
county fair. Not of
From
interrogation.
300
yards through field
of
glasses.
everything.
It looked like an M4
His hands
Sherman
shook
tank.
continuously.
Private
His
Daniel
eyes
Tompkins
darted
stood
to
every
watching.
sound, hands shoved deep
When
in
the
his
American
jacket
major
pockets.
entered the room to begin
He
questioning,
painted signs
Peter
for
flinched
department
so
stores
violently
before
he
he nearly
nearly
fell from his chair. Now he painted unit
major
insignia
asked
on
standard
rubber.
questions.
The absurdity
Unit
hadn't
designation.
worn off.
Commander's
Around him,
name.
200 men worked in
Number of
practice
troops in his
silence,
company.
inflating more tanks.
Peter answered in
positioning them
stammering
information,
German,
his
draping
voice breaking on
camouflage
every
netting
third
to
word.
suggest
crews sleeping nearby.
As
Marie-Thérèse translated
They were
his
artists,
responses,
mostly.
she noticed something in his eyes. Fashion designers. The same thousand-yard
Broadway
stare
set
she had seen in
decorators.
shell-shocked soldiers
Men
from
who
every
understood
army. Shadow and perspective,
The look
and
of
how
someone
the
whose
human
mind
mind
could
had
be
been
fooled.
pushed past the point of recovery.
The question
nobody could answer was
Midway
whether
through the
German eyes could be
interrogation,
fooled the
the
same
major
way.
asked
Peter a direct question.
Colonel Harry
Did you
Reid
participate in
inflatable
inflatable actions
Shermans,
against
his
Italian
boots
civilians?
crunching
on gravel. Peter's hands
He
stopped
commanded
shaking. Real armor before this assignment. For 5 seconds, he sat
The 46th
completely still.
Armored
Infantry Regiment. Then he began to cry. Men in steel and diesel fuel. Not quiet tears. Now he commanded
Convulsive
sobbing
sobbing
that shook his entire body. Visual deception might
He
work
bent
in modern
forward
warfare.
over the
table, his bandaged
The British
head in his
claimed
hands,
success
and
in
went
North
through the
Africa.
kind of grief that comes from
Dummy
faces
tanks
too
had
deep for
confused
words.
Rommel
at El Alamein. The American major looked
Fake
supply
uncomfortable.
depots had drawn German
Ask him
bombers
what's
away
wrong.
from real positions. Marie-Thérèse asked. But North Africa was desert. Peter could not answer. Open terrain. Could only cry and
Long
shake
sight
and gasp
lines.
for air between sobs. Normandy would be different. She waited. Villages. The major waited. Hedgerows. The guards at the door. Germans who'd spent 4 years preparing defenses. Finally, studying every
lifted his
kilometer
head
and began to speak in German so rapid and desperate that she had to ask him to slow down. If the deception looked fake, what he confessed was this. If 3 weeks earlier, his unit had been ordered to conduct a reprisal action against a village north of Florence where partisans had attacked a German supply convoy. Just imagination and rubber tanks that the orders came from a Colonel Peter had never met. The unit had a designation. The orders were explicit. 23rd Headquarters
Kill
Special
everyone.
Troops. Burn
The
everything.
men
Called it something else. Leave nothing standing. The Ghost Army. Peter's company had been activated in January. These were mostly boys from small towns in Bavaria and Saxony. No training manual. Conscripts who had been farmers and shop created a unit specifically designed for tactical deception. They did not want to murder civilians. George Washington had used spies and misinformation at Trenton. This was a legal order under the laws of reprisal, sonic, and radio deception would be treated as mutiny and dealt with. They were inventing it. So they went to the village. Ingersoll had pushed the concept. And they did what they were ordered to do. An advertising executive Peter described it in terrible detail. Now assigned to military intelligence. The way the villagers had initially thought they were there for a standard reconnaissance photos from British deception operations. The way children had waved at them. Studied how Rommel's intelligence officers had been systematically misled about Allied strength and positions. The way the screaming started. If the British could do it in Africa, shooting a woman who was running with a baby. He described the way she fell and the baby rolled from her arms, the enemy wasted resources the baby too because leaving it alive would have been worse. Recruitment had been unusual. He described his friend from home. They needed men who could think like Matthias, who had worked in his father's bakers would believe, putting his rifle in his own artists who understood light rather than continue. Sound engineers who could fake the village burning. Radio the way the flames looked against the communication patterns so precisely that the way the smoke-finding units would track the way they had marched away from it afterward. The unit's average IQ measured there were no words for what they had just done. Higher than most combat divisions. Translated all of this for the American major. But intelligence didn't guarantee survival. Her voice remained steady. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simmons ran the training. She converted Peter's German confession into English testimony with the same mechanical accuracy. How to create tire tracks that matched real armored vehicles. But inside, something was breaking. Radio antennas at heights that suggested specific unit types. Peter how answered. To walk, talk, she translated soldiers from divisions that the interrogation continued for another hour. Deception wasn't just visual. When it finished, the major thanked her and left to write his report. Every detail had to align. Peter was taken to a holding cell to await transfer to a POW camp. They cross-referenced remained in the schoolhouse with aerial reconnaissance with the afternoon sun came through high windows. One inconsistency could unravel everything floating in the air. The equipment arrived throughout February. She could hear American soldiers laughing about inflatable tanks from Goodyear. Inside, she could still hear German replica cost $85. She thought about Klaus Weber's question. A real tank cost $30,000. Witness murder and then eat soup. The army ordered hundreds. And now she had the answer. They came with hand pumps initially. A person does until someone realized inflation took too long. A person cries in an interrogation room 3 weeks later while mounted on strangers. Loud enough that operators forever like a wound that never heals from German lines. But she had a new question. How does the translator carry these confessions? How does the person who bears witness to the witness continue to function? That night, Marie-Thérèse did not sleep. Camp Florence, she lay in her narrow bed in a room that still smelled of chalk from when the building had filled the hollow form, and she replayed every interrogation she had translated, hands steadying what every confession she had collapsed heap of rubberized every moment of human horror she had converted from one language to another. In 90 seconds, it took shape. Klaus Weber photographing the turret rose first, then the hull, Peter Hoffman then shooting a woman with a baby. From 20 feet away, the French resistance operative whose hatred was justified by occupation. A toy. The American soldiers children might play with by combat. From the 300 yards through sealed glass, terrifying. It looked like an M4 Sherman tank. She carried all of them. Private Daniel Tompkins stood watching, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Every contradictory reality signs that made the war simultaneously justified and unjustified. Now he painted unit insignia, and she understood with sudden clarity that she could not be worn off. The burden of understanding was no longer sustainable. Practiced silence. She was breaking under the weight of other people's guilt and her own inability to reconcile the contradictions she had accumulated nearby. The next morning, she requested a meeting with the British major who coordinated Red Cross translators Broadway set decorators. She told him she needed to stop working in interrogation center and how the human eye could be fooled. That 3 years had been too long. The question nobody could answer was whether German eyes could be fooled or administrative duties or anything. Colonel Harry Reeder walked among the inflatable Shermans, his boots crunching. The major was sympathetic but firm. He'd commanded real armor before this assignment because you've done this so long. The 46th Armored Infantry Regiment. The prisoners. Men and steel and information others miss. Now he commanded rubber for the final push into northern Italy that visual deception might translate modern more than ever. The British claimed success in North Africa. She said in English. Dummy tanks had confused Rommel at El Alamein. You're the best translator we have. Fake supply depots had drawn German bombers away from real positions. Then what is? But North Africa was desert. How could she articulate that understanding both sides had made her incapable of serving either? Normandy would be different. That she had heard too many confessions and carried too much humanity and existed in a moral space that was spent 4 years preparing defenses. I know studying every kilometer of coastline, photographing from the air that make the war impossible to comprehend. If the deception looked fake, the operation confessions that make everyone simultaneously guilty and German artillery would target it. I cannot maintain the distance necessary to be heavy weapons. The major's imagination for rubber tanks that deflated when punctured. You've developed sympathy for the prisoners. Unit had a designation. It was not a question. 23rd Headquarters Special It was an accusation. The men called it something understanding, she corrected. The Ghost Army, which is different and worse. Activated in January. Marie-Thérèse, no precedent. Understanding the enemy is useful for intelligence. The U.S. Army had never created a unit specifically designed for tactical deception. I am not paralyzed. George Washington had used spies and misinformation. And there is a difference. But systematic visual could not let her stop, and radio deception the war needed translators. They were inventing it. The final campaigns in Italy required people who could navigate the linguistic and psychological advertising executive in civilian life. Now her experience was too valuable to London. So she continued. Reconnaissance photos from British deception operations and October as Allied forces studied how Rommel's intelligence officers had been systematic winter said about Allied strength and positions. Through December as the war ground toward its eventual Americans could do it in France. But something fundamental had changed through illusion. The breaking point had been enemy waste resources attacking. She continued translating, but she no longer believed in the utility of translation. They needed men who could think like enemies. She continued converting confessions from one language to another, but she no longer believed the confession served any purpose except sound engineers who could fake audio. Radio became a repository for guilt that was not her own so precisely that German directions finding units contradicted each other. Divisions. A woman who understood too much to measure 119 certainty that war required, higher than most combat divisions. And in that understanding, she found not wisdom but isolation survival. Because the translator Colonel hears confessions from both sides ultimately stands alone. How to inflate a dummy tank that neither side acknowledges and that no one else can share. How to create tire tracks that matched real armored vehicles. How to string radio antennas at heights that suggested specific unit types. How to walk, talk, and act like soldiers from divisions that didn't exist. Deception wasn't just visual. It was behavioral. Every detail had to align. German intelligence officers were professionals. They cross-referenced signals intercepts with aerial reconnaissance with ground reports. One inconsistency could unravel everything. The equipment arrived throughout February and March. Inflatable tanks from Goodyear. Each Sherman replica cost $85. A real tank cost $30,000. The Army ordered hundreds. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines. May 3, 1945. The war in Europe ended on a Tuesday. The canvas hissed as
was in
compressed
Milan
air
when
filled
news
the
of
hollow
Germany's
surrender reached Allied
men
headquarters.
guided the inflation.
American
Soldiers
soldiers
moments
cheered.
before had been a collapsed heap
Italian
of rubberized
civilians
fabric
emerged
weighing
from
less than
buildings to
100
celebrate in
pounds.
streets that had been empty
In
for
90
weeks.
seconds, it took shape.
Church bells rang across the
turret
city
rose
for the first time in
then
months.
the hull, then the tread.
She stood in the courtyard of the
From
building
20
where
feet
she had
away,
been translating
it looked
prisoner
ridiculous.
interviews and listened to the
A
celebration.
balloon.
Joy
toy.
surrounded her. Something children
Relief.
might play with at a county fair.
Victory.
From
The end of
300
something
yards through
terrible.
field glasses,
But
it
she
looked
felt
like
nothing
an M4
except
Sherman
exhaustion.
tank.
A
Private
British
Daniel
captain
Tompkins
found her
stood
standing
watching,
alone and
hands
offered
shoved
champagne
deep
that
in
had
his
been
jacket
liberated
pocket.
from a German officer's private
He painted
stock.
signs for department
She
stores
accepted
before
the
the
glass,
war, but did not drink. Now he painted
He
unit
asked if she
insignia
was
on
all
her
right.
right. The
She said
absurdity
yes.
hadn't worn off. He thanked her for her
Around
service
him,
and
200
returned to the
men
celebration.
worked in
Practiced silence.
After he
Inflating
left,
more tanks,
she poured the
positioning
champagne
them
onto
onto
the
the
cobblestones
and
and watched
watched
it spread
netting
between
the
the
stones
stones
like
like
dark
sleeping
blood.
nearby.
The war
They
had
were
ended.
artists, mostly.
But what exactly had ended
Fashion
for her?
designers.
The confession
Broadway
she carried
set
did not
decorators.
disappear with Germany's surrender. Men who understood shadow
Klaus
and
Weber's
perspective
morphine
and how the
weakened
human
voice
eye could be
asking,
fooled.
"Then
why do we fight?" The question
Still
nobody
echoed
could
in her
answer
memory.
was whether German eyes
Peter
could be fooled
Hoffman's
the same
description
way.
of shooting a woman with
Colonel
a baby
Harry
still
Reader
replayed
walked
in
among the
perfect
inflatable
detail.
Shermans, his
The
boots
hundreds of
crunching
other
on
confessions
gravel. She had translated
He
still
commanded
existed
real
in the
honor
archives
before
of
this
her mind
assignment.
like documents that could
The
never be
46th
destroyed.
Armored Infantry Regiment.
Victory had been achieved.
Men in steel and diesel
Fascism
fuel
had been defeated. Now he commanded
The cause
rubber
was
and
just,
compressed
and the
air
outcome
and a
was
slim
right.
hope that visual deception might
Marie-Thérèse
work
could
in
not
modern
celebrate
warfare because she knew too
The
much
British
about the
claimed
cost.
success in North Africa.
Not just the material cost
Dummy
measured
tanks
in
had
casualties
confused
and
Rommel at
destruction,
El Alamein.
but the psychological
supply
cost
depots
measured
had
in
drawn German
confessions
bombers
away
away
from
from
real
accumulated
positions
and
understanding that made
But North
simplicity
Africa
impossible.
was desert.
In June,
Open
the
terrain.
Red Cross began demobilizing
Long
translators. Normandy would be
Marie-Thérèse
submitted her resignation and
Villages.
prepared to return to Switzerland.
Hedgerows.
On her final day
Germans
in
who'd
Milan,
spent 4
she
years
was called to
preparing
translate
defenses,
one last
studying
interview.
every kilometer of
The
coastline.
prisoner was an
The
SS
photographer
colonel
from
who
the
had
air
been
daily.
captured in the final days of
If the
fighting.
deception looked fake,
He was
the
being
operation
questioned about
failed.
war crimes committed by
If
his
it looked
unit
too
during the
real,
German retreat
German
through
artillery
northern
would
Italy.
target
And readers'
Standard
men had
procedure.
no armor, no heavy weapons.
Document atrocities.
Just imagination
Build
and rubber
cases for
tanks that
tribunals.
deflated when punctured. Establish
The
accountability.
unit
Had a designation. The American major
23rd
conducting the
Headquarters
interview
Special
asked the
Troops.
colonel about a massacre in a
The
village
men
near
called it
Parma.
something else.
The colonel confirmed
Ghost
that his
Army.
unit had conducted the
They'd
operation.
been
activated in January. He provided details with
No
clinical
precedent.
precision. No
Numbers
training
killed.
manual. Methods
The
U.S.
used.
Army had never created a
Rationale
unit
based on
specifically
partisan
designed for
activity in
tactical
the area.
deception.
George
Marie-Thérèse
Washington
translated
had
his
used
words
spies
into
and
English.
misinformation
at Trenton. The same mechanical process
systematic
she had
visual,
performed 1,000
sonic,
times.
and
radio deception as
Convert
doctrine.
one language to another.
They were inventing it. Preserve meaning while
Major Ralph
maintaining
Ingersoll
professional
had
pushed the
distance.
concept. But as she
An
translated the
advertising
colonel's
executive
description
in
of
civilian
burning
life,
families
now
alive in their
assigned
homes,
to military
she felt
intelligence
something
in
inside
London.
her finally break completely. He'd seen reconnaissance photos not from British
dramatically,
deception operations,
not with tears or visible
studied
emotion.
how Rommel's intelligence officers
Just a quiet
had been
internal
systematically
collapse
misled
like a
about
foundation
Allied
giving
strength
way.
and positions. When the interrogation
If the British
ended,
could do
she
it in
walked out
Africa,
of the room and
Americans
kept
could
walking.
do it in France.
Out of the building. Save lives through
illusion.
the streets of Milan. Make the enemy
She
waste
walked for
resources
2 hours
attacking without
ghosts.
destination or purpose.
Recruitment
just
had
moving
been
through the
unusual.
city that was celebrating victory.
They needed
while she
men who
carried
could
defeat.
think like enemies.
That
Anticipate
evening,
what
she
observers
returned
would
to her
believe.
quarters and wrote a letter. Artists who understood
Not
lighting.
to
anyone specific. Sound engineers
Just
who could
words
fake
on
audio
paper
that needed to exist
Radio
outside her own
operators who
mind.
could
mimic communication
The letter
patterns so
began,
precisely
"I have
that
heard
German
confessions
veterans
from
find
both
both
sides
sides
of
of
the
track
war.
phantom divisions. I know things about
The unit's
soldiers that
average
their
IQ
families will
measured
never know.
119.
I understand
Higher
truths
than
about
most
this
combat
conflict that
divisions.
contradict every simple
But
narrative
intelligence
about good versus
didn't guarantee
evil. Survival. And I do not know what to
Lieutenant
do with
Colonel
this
Clifford
understanding.
Simmons
ran the training. She continued.
How to
the German
inflate a
soldiers
dummy
I
tank in under
translated
20
for were not
minutes.
monsters. How to create
Some
tire
were true
tracks that
believers
matched
in
evil
evil
ideologies.
vehicles.
How
But
to
most
string
were just
radio
young
antennas
men
at
who wanted
heights
to
that
survive.
suggested specific unit
They
types.
confessed their fears to me
How
because
to
I
walk,
spoke their
talk,
language
and
and they had
act
no
like
one else to
soldiers from
tell.
divisions that didn't exist.
They
described their guilt, their
Deception
doubts,
wasn't just
their
visual.
horror at what they had become.
It was behavioral.
And I carried those
Every
confessions
detail
while
had to align.
simultaneously translating for
German
Allied
intelligence
officers who
officers
saw
were
only enemies
professionals.
who deserved death. They cross-referenced
She wrote,
signals
"The
intercepts
Americans
with
and
aerial
British I worked
reconnaissance
for
were
were
not
not
heroes.
reports.
They
One
were complicated
inconsistency
men
could
fighting a
unravel
justified
everything.
war through unjustified justifiable
The equipment
methods.
arrived throughout February
They
and
bombed
March.
cities.
Inflatable
They
tanks
killed
from Goodyear.
prisoners. They
Each
celebrated
Sherman
their own
replica cost
atrocities when
$85.
convenient. They
A real
confessed
tank
this to me
cost
not as
30,000,
crimes but as necessities.
The army ordered hundreds.
And I translated their words
They
into
came with
something
hand
more
pumps
palatable
initially,
for official
until
records.
someone realized inflation
The letter
took too
concluded,
long.
I no longer believe
Then
in
compressors
translation.
arrived.
I no longer
Portable
believe
units
that
mounted
converting
on
words
jeeps,
from one language to another
loud
serves
enough
any
that operators
purpose
had
except
to
to make
inflate
war more
decoys
efficient.
far from German lines.
I have spent 3 years facilitating communication between people who should never have been able to speak to each other. And all I have accomplished is to give voice to atrocities in multiple languages.
May
She
3rd,
folded the letter and placed it in a
1944.
drawer. Camp
She
Forest,
never sent
Tennessee. Because
The
who could she
canvas
send it
hissed
to?
as compressed air filled
Who
the
would understand
hollow
the
form?
particular burden of the
For men
translator
guided
who
the
exists
inflation
between
hand
worlds,
studying what moments before
Marie-Thérèse
returned
returned
to
to
Geneva
Geneva
in July
weighing less than
1945.
100 pounds. Her parents
In
welcomed
90
her home
seconds,
with
they
relief.
took shape.
Friends and
The
former
turret rose
colleagues
first,
asked about
then
her
the
war
hull,
experiences
then the
with the
treads.
kind of curious excitement
From
that
20
people
feet
reserve
away,
for
it
stories
looked
they expected to
ridiculous.
be adventurous. A balloon. She told them nothing
A toy.
substantive. Something
Said
children
she had
might
worked
play
as a
with at a county
translator.
fair. Said it
From
had been
300
difficult
yards
but
through
important. Field glasses.
Said
It looked
she was
like
glad
an
to be
M4
home.
Sherman tank. They accepted
Private
these vague
Daniel
answers
Tompkins
and did
stood
not
watching,
press for details. Hands shoved deep in his
How
jacket
could she
pockets.
explain?
He
How
painted
could she tell
signs
people
for
who had
department
lived
stores
through the
before
war
in
in
neutral
war?
Switzerland about the
Now
confessions
he
she had
painted
heard.
unit insignia on rubber.
About Klaus Weber and
The
Peter
absurdity
Hoffman and
hadn't
the
worn
SS
off.
colonel and the hundreds of other men
Around him,
whose guilt she
200
carried
men
like
worked
physical
in
weight.
practiced silence.
She
Inflating
inflating
more
more tanks, positioning
she
them
remained
information,
silent.
draping camouflage.
The University
netting to
of
suggest
Geneva
crews
offered
for
her
a
a
position
position
in the linguistics
They
department.
were artists, mostly.
She declined. Fashion
The
designers.
Red Cross offered her a permanent
Broadway
position
set
managing
decorators.
translation services.
Men who understood
She
shadow
declined.
and perspective and how
The
the
Swiss
Swiss
Foreign
Foreign
Ministry
Ministry suggested she might be
The question
valuable
nobody
in
could
diplomatic
answer
work.
was whether German eyes
She
could be fooled
declined
the same way.
Everyone who
Colonel
asked
Harry
why
Reeder
received the
walked
same
among the
answer.
inflatable
She
Shermans,
needed time to
his
recover.
boots crunching on gravel.
They assumed she meant
He'd
physical
commanded
recovery
real armor
from the
before
stress
this
of war
assignment.
work. They
The
did not
46th
understand she
Armored
meant
Infantry
psychological
Regiment.
recovery from troops
Men
that
in
had
steel and
fundamentally
diesel
altered her
fuel.
understanding of human nature.
Now he commanded rubber and
She spent
compressed
the
air
autumn of
and a slim hope that
1945
visual
in her parents'
deception
house
might
in
work in
Geneva,
modern warfare.
reading books that had nothing to
The
do
British
with the war
claimed
and walking
success
along
in North
Lake Geneva
Africa.
shore in weather that grew
Dummy
progressively
tanks had
colder.
confused Rommel at El Alamein.
She avoided places where veterans
Fake
gathered
supply
to share
depots
war
had
stories.
drawn German bombers away from
She
real
refused
positions.
invitations to lectures
But
about
North
the Allied
Africa
victory.
was desert.
She existed
Open
in
terrain.
careful isolation from anything
Long
that
sight
might trigger
lines.
the memories she was trying to
Normandy
suppress.
would be different.
But suppression did not
Villages.
work.
Hedgerows.
The confessions remained. Germans who'd spent
At
4
night,
years
she
preparing
dreamed in
defenses,
multiple languages.
studying every kilometer of
Klaus
coastline,
Weber speaking
photographing
German
about
from
the
the
air
air daily.
graphing executions. If the deception looked
Peter
fake,
Hoffman
the
crying in
operation
German
about
failed.
shooting a baby. If it looked too
American
real,
soldiers
German
speaking
artillery
English
was
about
targeted,
their fear.
and Reader's men had no
French
armor,
resistance
no heavy
operatives
weapons.
speaking
French about their hatred. Just imagination and rubber
All of them
tanks that
confessing
deflated
to
when
her.
punctured. All of them
The unit
seeking
had
a
a
designation
designation.
she could not provide.
23rd Headquarters
She began
Special
experiencing what would later be
The men
recognized
called
as
it
symptoms
something
of what
else.
was then called war
The
neurosis,
Ghost Army.
and would eventually be
They'd
termed
been
post-traumatic
activated in
stress
January.
disorder.
No
Inability
president.
to sleep. No training
Intrusive
manual.
memories.
The U.S.
Emotional
Army had
numbness
never created
interrupted
a
by
unit
sudden
specifically
intense
designed
anxiety.
for tactical deception.
Difficulty connecting with
George
people
Washington
who had not
had used
experienced the
spies
war.
and misinformation at Trenton.
But in 1945,
But systematic
symptoms
visual,
had no name
sonic,
and no
and
treatment.
radio deception as doctrine.
She was simply a woman who
They
had
were
worked
inventing
too
it.
hard for too long and
Major
needed
Ralph
rest.
Ingersoll had pushed the
That
concept.
was the diagnosis.
An advertising
That was the
executive in
understanding.
civilian life, now
No
assigned
one
to military
recognized that she
intelligence
suffered
in
from a
London.
unique form of trauma.
He'd seen reconnaissance
Not the
photos
trauma
from
of
British
combat
deception
or direct
operations.
violence.
Studied
But the
how
trauma
Rommel's
of
intelligence
understanding.
officers had been
The trauma
systematically
of
misled
carrying
about
other
Allied
people's
strength
guilt.
and positions. The trauma of
If
existing
the British
between
could
two
do it in
narratives
Africa,
and believing
Americans
in neither.
could do it in France.
In December, on the
Saved
6th
lives
anniversary
through
of
illusion.
VE Day,
Made
Marie-Thérèse
the enemy
attended a
waste
memorial
resources
service at
attacking
Geneva's
ghosts.
Cathedral of St. Pierre.
Recruitment had been unusual.
The service honored Swiss citizens
They needed
who had
men who
died
could
during the
think
war
like
years,
enemies.
anticipate
It was
what
meant to be
observers would
solemn and
believe.
respectful.
Artists
But
who
during the
understood
minister's
lighting,
sermon about sacrifice
sound
and honor,
engineers who
she
could fake
felt
audio,
sudden
overwhelming rage,
radio operators
what
who
did
could
these
mimic
people know
communication
about sacrifice
patterns
so precisely that German
What did they
direction-finding
understand
units
about
would
honor?
track phantom divisions?
They had lived in Switzerland
The
while
unit's
the
average
continent
IQ
burned.
measured 119.
They had maintained their comfortable
higher
neutrality
than
while
most
she had
combat
sat in
divisions.
interrogation rooms
But
translating
intelligence
confessions
didn't
from men who had
guarantee
murdered
survival.
children and men who had ordered those
Lieutenant
murders
Colonel
and men who
Clifford
had witnessed
Simmons
those
ran the
murders
training.
and done nothing.
How to inflate She a dummy
left the
tank in
cathedral
under
before
40
the
minutes.
service ended.
How to create
home
tire
through
tracks
Geneva's
that matched
clean
real
streets
armored
where no
vehicles
buildings
had been bombed and
How
no
to
bodies
string
had
radio
littered the
antennas
pavement.
at heights that suggested
And understood
specific
with
unit
terrible
types.
clarity that she would never
How
be
to
able to
walk,
return to the
talk,
Switzerland
and
she had
act
left
like
in
soldiers from
1940.
divisions that didn't exist.
Because she had seen what existed
Deception
on the other
wasn't
side
just
of
visual.
neutrality. It was
Had
behavioral.
heard the confessions that revealed
Every
how thin the
detail
line
had to
was
align
between
civilization and
German
barbarism.
intelligence officers were
Had translated
professionals.
the words that proved
They
every nation and
cross-referenced
every
signals
ideology
intercepts
and
with
every
every
soldier was
reconnaissance with
capable
ground
found both heroism and horror. One inconsistency and she carried that knowledge everything. The translator who had heard confederations from both sides of the war. Inflatable tanks from who understood too much to ever be Sherman replica cost $85. The aftermath of her war would last longer than the war itself. The army ordered hundreds. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines. May 3,
1944.
2 years after the war ended,
Camp Forest,
Marie-Thérèse
Tennessee.
received a letter forwarded through the
The
International
canvas
Committee
hissed
of the Red
compressed
Cross.
air filled the hollow form.
The return address was
For
Munich,
men guided
Germany.
the inflation.
Hands
The
steadying
handwriting was
moments
careful
before had
and
been a
formal.
collapsed heap of rubberized
She
fabric
recognized the
weighing less
name
than 100
immediately.
pounds. Klaus
In
Weber.
90 seconds, it
The
took
German
shape.
lieutenant she had
The
translated
turret
for in
rose
the field
first,
hospital
then
at
the hull,
Anzio.
then the treads.
The engineering student
From
who had
20 feet
confessed
away,
about
it
photographing
looked
executions.
A
The
balloon.
young man who had prayed not
A
to have
toy.
to kill anyone. Something children
Her
might
hands
play
shook
with
as
at a
she
county
opened
fair.
the envelope.
From
Klaus
300
wrote in
yards through
German.
field glasses, he had
It looked like
survived
an
the war.
M4 Sherman tank.
Had spent 18
Private
months in a
Daniel
POW
Tompkins stood
camp in
watching,
North Africa.
hands shoved deep in his
Had
jacket
returned to
pockets.
Munich in late
He
1946
painted
to find
signs
his
for
family's
department
bookstores
stores before
destroyed
the
by
war.
Allied bombing. Now he painted
His father
unit
had
insignia
died in
on
the
rubber.
raid.
His
The
mother
absurd
and sister
had
had
worn off.
survived and were living with relatives
Around
in the
him,
countryside.
200
men worked in practice.
He had tracked down Marie-Thérèse
inflating more through
tanks,
Red Cross
positioning
records.
them information.
He wrote
draping
because he needed to
netting
tell
to
her
suggest
something.
crews sleeping nearby.
Needed to confess one more
They were
time to the
artists,
woman who had
mostly.
understood him when he was wounded and
Fashion
morphine
designers.
confused and willing to speak truth.
Broadway set decorators.
You ask me why we fight. Men who
he wrote.
understood shadow and perspective.
I have thought
and
about
how
that
the human
question
eye
for
could be
3
fooled.
years.
The question
nobody
nobody
could
could answer
answer
was
no
whether German
satisfactory
eyes
answer.
could be fooled the same way.
We fight because
Colonel Harry
circumstances
Reid
made
had
it
walked
seem
among the
necessary.
inflatable Shermans,
Because
his boots
propaganda
crunchy
makes
makes
it
it seem
seem
honorable. He'd commanded
Because
real
fear
armor
makes it
before
seem
this
inevitable.
assignment. But none of these
46th
reasons
Armored
justify
Infantry
what I
Regiment.
witnessed and participated
Men
in.
in steel and diesel fuel.
He continued. I think
Now
about
he
the
commanded
executions
rubber
I
and
compressed
photographed.
air and the slim hope that
About the
visual
villages
deception
we
might work
destroyed.
in modern warfare. About the people who
The
died
British
because I
claimed
followed
success
orders
in
rather
North
than
Africa.
conscience. Dummy
And I
tanks had
cannot find
confused Rommel
forgiveness
at
for
El
myself.
Alamein.
I
Fake
cannot
supply
find
depots
meaning in
had
survival
drawn
when
German
so many
bombers away
others
from
did
real
not survive.
positions. His
But
letter
North
concluded,
Africa was
you were
desert.
kind to me when you did not
Open
have
terrain.
to be. You
Long
listened to
sight
confessions
lines.
you should not have heard. Normandy would be different. You understood things that made your
Villages.
position more difficult.
Hedgerows.
I wanted you to know
Germans
that your
who
understanding
spent 4
4
years
years preparing defenses,
even if it
studying
changed
nothing
every
about what
kilometer
I
of
had done or
coastline,
what I would do. Photographing from the air daily. The fact that one person understood
If the deception
made the
looked
unbearable
fake,
slightly
the
more
operation
bearable.
failed.
Marie-Thérèse read the letter
real,
3 times.
German
artillery would target it.
Then she
and
placed it
Rita's
in a
men
wooden
had
box
no
with
armor,
the letters
she
no
had
heavy
written to no
weapons.
one in May 1945.
Just imagination and rubber tanks
Documents
that
of
deflated
confession that
unpunctured.
existed outside official
The unit
records.
had a
designation. Private communications
23rd
between people
Headquarters
who had
Special
glimpsed the
Troops.
humanity underneath the
The
war.
men called it something else.
She did not reply to Klaus.
The Ghost Army.
What could she say?
They'd been activated in January.
That she forgave him. No precedent.
She had no standing to offer
no
forgiveness.
training manual. That she
The
understood.
U.S. Army had never created
She had
a unit
already
specifically
demonstrated
designed for
understanding
tactical
during their
deception.
conversations in Anzio. George Washington
That
had
his
used
confession
spies
made
and
a
misinformation at Trenton. It did not. But systematic visual,
Men were still
sonic,
dead.
and radio deception
Villages
as
were
doctrine.
still destroyed.
They were inventing
The
it.
war
had happened regardless
Major
of
Ralph
anyone's
Ingersoll had
understanding.
pushed
the concept. So she remained
An
silent.
advertising executive in
and the
civilian
silence
life,
felt like its
now
own
assigned
form
to
of military
communication.
intelligence in London. An acknowledgement that some things existed beyond the capacity of words to operations. Over the
Studied
following
how
years,
Rommel's
she
intelligence
received 4
officers
more
had been
letters systematically misled about Allied strength and positions. A German sergeant
If the
who had
British could
surrendered
do it in
near
Africa,
Bologna, Americans could
an
do it in
Italian
France.
soldier
who had deserted and
saved
sought
lives
allies
through
through
illusion.
illusion. An
Make the
Austrian
enemy
conscript
waste
who had been
resources
captured
attacking
during the
ghosts.
final days of fighting. Recruitment had been
All of them
unusual.
writing to thank her for her
They
understanding.
needed men who could think like enemies,
For her kindness
anticipate
during
what
interrogations.
observers would believe, for treating them
Artists
as
who
humans rather
understood
than
lighting.
enemies.
She
Sound
did not
engineers
reply
who could
to any
fake
of them.
audio. Not
Radio
out of operators who could mimic communication
because she
patterns so
understood that her
precisely
role
that
had
German
never been
direction
to
provide
find
units
absolute
would track phantom divisions.
Only to bear witness.
The unit's average IQ
To
measured
translate their
119
confessions
and carry them forward.
higher than most combat
What they
divisions.
did with their own guilt was beyond
But
her
intelligence
capacity
didn't
to guarantee
influence.
survival. In 1949,
Lieutenant Colonel Clifford
Marie-Thérèse
Simmons
finally
ran the
agreed to speak publicly about
How
her
to
war
inflate a dummy
experiences.
tank in under 20 minutes.
A Swiss academic was
How to
conducting
create
research
tire
on
tracks
neutral
that matched
nationals
real
who had
armored
served in
vehicles.
various capacities during
How
the
to
conflict.
string radio antennas at
He
heights that
interviewed
secure
just
her
at parents'
specific
house in
unit
Geneva.
types.
The
How to
interview
walk,
lasted
talk,
3 hours.
and act like soldiers from
the
divisions
academic
that didn't
asked about her
exist.
training, her
Deception
assignments,
wasn't
her
just
experiences
visual.
translating in
It was
different
behavioral.
locations. Every
She answered his
detail had to
questions with
align.
professional precision.
German intelligence
Described her
officers
work
were without
professionals.
emotional commentary. They cross-referenced
Provided the
signals
kind of
intercepts with
information
aerial
that would fit
reconnaissance
neatly
with
into ground
academic
reports.
analysis. One
At the end of
inconsistency
the
could
interview,
unravel
the
everything.
academic asked,
What
the
was the most
equipment
difficult
arrived
aspect
throughout
of February
February
and March? Marie-Thérèse considered
Inflatable
the
tanks
question.
from Goodyear.
She thought
Each
about
Sherman
Klaus Weber
replica
and
cost
Peter Hoffmann.
$85.
About the SS
A real
colonel
tank
and the
cost
French
30,000.
resistance operative. The army
About the
ordered
hundreds
hundreds
of confessions she had
They
translated
came with
and the
hand pumps
impossible
initially
burden of
until
understanding
someone
both
realized
sides.
inflation took too
The
long.
most difficult aspect,
Then she
compressors
finally
arrived,
answered.
was that translation
Portable
is an
units
act
mounted
of
on
empathy.
jeeps.
To accurately
Loud enough
convey
that
meaning from
operators
one
had to
language to
inflate
another
decoys far
requires
from
understanding
German
the
lines.
speaker's perspective.
And when you understand the perspectives of both sides in a conflict, you lose the ability to see either side as purely right or purely wrong. You become suspended between contradictory truths. And that suspension is unbearable. The academic wrote this down. Then asked a follow-up question, do you believe your work made a difference? Did the translations you provided help end the war? She did not answer immediately. She thought about all the interrogations. All the confessions. All the information extracted and transmitted and converted into intelligence that informed military decisions that led to more deaths that led to eventual victory. I believe my work made killing more efficient, she said. Which is not the same as making a difference. The academic published his research 2 years later. Marie-Thérèse's testimony was included in a chapter about linguistic workers in war zones. Her quote about translation and empathy was highlighted as particularly insightful. But reading her words in print, removed from the context of 3 years translating confessions in Italian interrogation rooms, compressed air filled the hollow only emptiness. For men the academic had converted her experience into moments before had been a collapsed heap of rubberized fabric into evidence supporting his thesis about the role of neutral nationals in total war. It took shape. He had translated her truth into something that fit his narrative, then the treads. And in that translation, 20 feet away, something essential had been lost. Just as something essential was always lost in translation. Something children might play with at a county fair. Marie-Thérèse had established a routine of careful isolation. It looked like an M4 Sherman tank at a library in Geneva. Private Daniel Tompkins stood alone in a small apartment near the university jacket pockets. She maintained minimal contact for department stores before the war. Now she read extensively unit insignia on rubber. Philosophy, the absurdity hadn't worn off. Camus and Sartre and writers who had struggled with questions about human nature and moral responsibility in the aftermath of European information, draping camouflage. She found some comfort in recognizing that others had experienced the same existential confusion she felt. Fashion designers, the war had broken more than just cities and armies. Set decorators. She never married. Men who understood shadow never and had children and how the human eye could be fooled. When acquaintances asked why, the question nobody could answer was whether German eyes could be fooled the same way. But the truth was Colonel Harry Reader walked among the inflatable Shermans, bringing children into a world where she had witnessed what humans were capable of doing real armor before this assignment. The confessions she carried had fundamentally altered her understanding of humanity. Men and steel and diesel fuel. She could not unhear Klaus Weber describing photographing rubber and compressed air and the slim hope that visual deception might work about shooting a baby. The British claimed the hundreds of other confessions that proved how easily ordinary people participated in extraordinary horror. Fake supply depots had drawn German knowledge away from real required to raise children who believed the world was fundamentally good. In 1960, 15 years after the war ended, Marie-Thérèse was diagnosed with a chronic anxiety disorder. Her doctor prescribed medication and suggested spent 4 years preparing defenses. She took the medication every kilometer of coastline, photographing from the air daily. To a therapist that her anxiety stemmed from carrying 15-year-old confessions from soldiers on both sides of a war. If it looked too real, German artillery was targeted, in a permanent and readers' morals had no armor between contradictory truths. Just that imagination of human nature had been permanently damaged by 3 years translating had a designation from one language to another. 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. So she lived with the anxiety. Something else. With the insomnia. The Ghost Army. With the intrusive memories that arrived without warning. No precedent. With the burden of being the woman no who training manuals from both sides and who the U.S. Army had never created a unit specifically designed for such tactical deception. The legacy of her war was not spies and misinformation at not victory, but systematic satisfaction of having served a just radio deception as doctrine. The legacy of her war was isolation. Major understanding that led to push the concept. Knowledge that advertising executive in civilian life. She had translated truth from one language to another for 3 years. He'd seen reconnaissance photos from British deception operations could not be translated into anything how Rommel's intelligence officers had been systematically misled about Allied strength and positions. If the British could do it in Africa, Americans could do it in France. Save lives through illusion. Make the enemy waste resources attacking ghosts. Recruitment had been unusual. They needed men who could think like enemies, anticipate what observers would believe. Artists who understood lighting. Sound engineers who could fake audio. Radio operators who could mimic communication patterns so precisely that German direction-finding units would track phantom divisions. The unit's average IQ measured 119. Higher than most combat divisions. But intelligence didn't guarantee survival. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simmons ran the training. How to inflate a dummy tank in under 20 minutes. How to create tire tracks that matched real armored vehicles. How to string radio antennas at heights that suggested specific unit types. How to walk, talk, and act like soldiers from divisions that didn't exist. Deception wasn't just visual. It was behavioral. Every detail had to align. German intelligence officers were professionals. They cross-referenced signals intercepts with aerial reconnaissance with ground reports. One inconsistency could unravel everything. The equipment arrived throughout February and March. Inflatable tanks from Goodyear. Each Sherman replica cost $85. A real tank cost $30,000. The Army ordered hundreds. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines. May 1965, 1944, 20 years after VE Day. Camp Forest, Tennessee. Marie-Thérèse was 48 years old and looked as compressed air filled the hollow. The chronic anxiety had carved lines into her face that made her appear perpetually exhausted. Before had been a collapsed heap of rubberized gray in her early less than 100 pounds. She moved through Geneva like a ghost haunting her own life. The turret on the anniversary of the war's end, she did what she had done every May 8 since 1945. It looked ridiculous. She walked to Lake Geneva's shore and spent the day alone, a toy. Something children might play with liberation or the justified celebration. From 300 yards Germany field glasses, it looked like remembering the Sherman tank. One after another. Daniel Tompkins stood watching, in German and English and French in his jacket pockets. Voices that had been dead for 2 decades still speaking in her memory with perfect clarity. Now he painted unit insignia. A young Swiss academic approached her on the lakeside path. The absurdity hadn't worn off. He was conducting research on multilingual workers during the war. Silence, inflating more her name in archives, positioning them information, wanted to interview her about her experiences as a Red Cross translator. They were artists, declined, mostly. He persisted. Fashion designers, said her perspective was historically valuable. Men who understood how translation worked in war zones could inform contemporary conflict resolution. The question nobody could answer was whether German eyes could be fooled the same way. My testimony matters to no one, she told him among the inflatable Shermans. I translated confessions that led to more deaths. He'd commanded real armor before this legacy of my work. The 46th Armored Infantry Regiment. The intelligence gathered and translations. Now he commanded rubber and compressed air and a slim hope that visual deception might work in modern warfare. Academic. The British claimed success in North Africa. The young man confused Rommel at El Alamein. She felt no sympathy. Fake supply depots had drawn German bombers away from real data that supported whatever thesis he was writing. But North Africa was desert. He wanted to translate her truth into something academically respectable. But her Normandy was not respectable. Villages. Her truth was that she had spent 3 years facilitating interrogations and extracted information from men who confessed studying every kilometer of coastline, and that information had been used to kill other men who would have confessed their humanity. If the deception looked fake, the operation failed. There was no academic framework if it looked too real. Reality. German artillery would target. She left the young academic standing on the lakeside, no heavy weapons, returned to her apartment. Just imagination and rubber tanks. She opened the wooden box that contained Klaus Weber's letter and a letter she had written to no one in May 1945. 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. She read both documents. The men called it something else. Then she added a third. The Ghost Army, a new letter. They'd been activated addressed in January. To no one. No written for the same reason someone might leave a message in a bottle. The U.S. Army had never created a unit specifically designed for tactical deception. I am 48 years old, she wrote. George Washington had used lived longer than most of the men whose confessions I translate. But systematic visual, Klaus Weber would be 43 if he still lives. Peter Hoffman would be 40 if he survived whatever psychological wounds I watched open in that interrogation room. An advertising executive in civilian life is probably now assigned to military intelligence or suicide or simple old age. He'd seen reconnaissance photos from British deception operations, but their confessions remain alive in me. Studied how Rommel's intelligence officers like diseases that never misled about Allied strength. I translate their truths every day in my mind. If the British could do it in Africa, Americans can do it in France. That serves no purpose except to remind me that I know things no person should know. Make the enemy waste resources attacking ghosts. Does not diminish. Recruitment had been unusual. 20 years have passed and the burden is identical to what I felt like in May 1945. Anticipate what observers would believe. I thought time would provide distance. Artists who understood lighting. I thought new experiences sound would engineers who could fake audio. But translation is operators who could mimic communication. Once you convert horror from one language to another, it exists in both languages forever. The unit's average IQ 7 languages of 119. She placed the letter in the wooden box with the others. But intelligence didn't get discovered after her death by relatives who would not understand their significance ran the training. Confessions from a translator dummy tank no one to translate for. How to create tire tracks that Swiss government honored citizens who had served in various capacities. How to string radio antennas at heights that suggested specific unit types. Received a formal letter inviting her to a ceremony in Bern where she would like soldiers from divisions that didn't exist. Humanitarian work during the deception wasn't just visual. She burned the letter. It was behavioral. Recognition was not what she had to align. She needed release from the burden of officers were professionals. She needed to forget Klaus Weber's morphine confessions with aerial reconnaissance and the SS colonel's clinical description of burning families alive. Could unravel everything. She needed to unhear every confession she had translated in March. But memory does not work that way. Goodyear. Understanding does not diminish. Cost $85. The translator carries forward what she has heard, and there is no mechanism for depositing that ordered anywhere except the grave. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines. By 1944, Marie-Thérèse rarely left her Forest, Tennessee. She had retired from the library. The canvas hissed as compressed air filled the hollow small pension. For men guided days reading and her nights studying what moments before had been a collapsed heap of rubberized fabric weighing less than 100 pounds. Concerned about her isolation. In 90 seconds, she tolerated these visits with polite distance. The turret rose first, then the hull. Let them believe she was simply aging poorly. From 20 feet away, let them attribute her withdrawal to natural reclusiveness rather than the specific trauma of carrying 30-year-old confessions. Something children might play with that revealed their humanity in moments of weakness. From 300 yards through field glasses, a cousin who had lived in Geneva throughout the war, asked her Private Daniel Tompkins stood watching those years, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Different. He painted signs for department stores before the war. Considered telling the truth. Now he painted unit insignia about the interrogation rooms and the confessions and the impossible burden of understanding both sides. Him, 200 men but she knew her cousin would not comprehend. Inflating more tanks, could not comprehend information, draping because comprehension required experience, sleeping nearby. And her experience was fundamentally untranslatable. Mostly. I learned too much about human nature. She finally set decorators. And the learning was men who understood shadow and perspective did not understand human eye could be fooled. But understanding was the question nobody could answer was whether German eyes could be fooled the same way. The point was saying aloud what existed in her memory so that at least once, his boots crunching on gravel, even if they could not grasp its full meaning. He commanded real armor before this assignment. In 1979, the 46th Armored Infantry Regiment, Marie-Thérèse Marchand died in her sleep in her Geneva apartment. Now he commanded rubber and compressed air and the slim hope that the official cause of death was modern warfare. But the British had known her success in North Africa. Simply exhausted her capacity to carry the confused Rommel at El Alamein. Her estate consisted primarily of supply depots had drawn German bombers away from real positions. Relatives found a wooden box but North Africa was desert. One from a German lieutenant named Klaus Weber. Long sight lines. Two written by Marie-Thérèse to no recipient. Villages. The relatives read the letters but did not understand them. Germans who'd spent 4 years away with other documents from her studying every kilometer of coastline, preserved them not because they recognized their significance, but because they seemed important to Marie-Thérèse the operation deserved preservation. If it looked too real, letters remained in a family archive in Geneva, and readers' men had confessions from a war that ended before most current residents were born. Just imagination and rubber tanks documents in languages that fewer people read each year. The unit had a designation. Testimony about experiences that grow increasingly abstract as direct memory fades into history. The men called it something else. But the letters exist. Army. And been activated in January. They document a truth that military histories ignore. That wars are fought not just on battlefields but in the psychological spaces. The U.S. Army had never created a unit specifically designed that some people carry burdens invisible to others. George Washington had used spies and misinformation. Both sides of a conflict can be more destructive than understanding neither sonic and radio deception. Marie-Thérèse Marchand was the translator. They were inventing confessions from both sides. Major Ralph Ingersoll had pushed the concept. And the weight of those confessions did not diminish with executive in civilian life. Did not resolve into wisdom. Military intelligence did not transform into meaning. He'd seen reconnaissance photos from British deception operations. Carried alone. Studied until Rommel's provided the only translation systematically misled about Allied strength and positions. If the British could do it in Africa, Americans could do it in France. Save lives through illusion. Make the enemy waste resources attacking ghosts. Recruitment had been unusual. They needed men who could think like enemies, anticipate what observers would believe. Artists who understood lighting. Sound engineers who could fake audio. Radio operators who could mimic communication patterns so precisely that German direction-finding units would track phantom divisions. The unit's average IQ measured 119. Higher than most combat divisions. But intelligence didn't guarantee survival. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simmons ran the training. How to inflate a dummy tank in under 20 minutes. How to create tire tracks that matched real armored vehicles. How to string radio antennas at heights that suggested specific unit types. How to walk, talk, and act like soldiers from divisions that didn't exist. Deception wasn't just visual. It was behavioral. Every detail had to align. German intelligence officers were professionals. They cross-referenced signals intercepts with aerial reconnaissance with ground reports. One inconsistency could unravel everything. The equipment arrived throughout February and March. Inflatable tanks from Goodyear. Each Sherman replica cost $85. A real tank cost $30,000. The Army ordered hundreds. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines.
Today,
May 3rd, there are no memorials for translators. Camp Forest, no monuments
Tennessee,
honoring the linguistic workers
canvas
who facilitated
hissed as compressed air
communication
filled the
between
hollow
armies.
form.
No
ceremonies
ceremonies recognizing those who existed in the spaces between languages,
a collapsed heap of
converting
rubberized
confessions
fabric
and
weighing
orders
less
and
than
pleas
100
from one
pounds.
tongue to another. In 90 seconds,
Marie-Thérèse
Marchand's name appears in some
The
Red
turret
Cross
rose
archives,
first,
then the hull,
listed
then the
among
treads. Thousands of workers who
From
served
20
in
feet
various
away,
capacities
it
during
looked
the
ridiculous.
conflict. Her
A balloon.
specific contributions are noted
toy.
in bureaucratic shorthand,
Something
children
Translator,
might play with at a
multiple
county
languages.
fair, Italian theater,
From 300 yards through field
to
glasses,
1945. It looked like an M4
The
Sherman
notation
tank.
does
Not capture what she
Private
actually
Daniel
did. Tompkins stood watching,
does not document
hands
the
shoved
hundreds
deep
of
into his jacket
interrogations.
pockets. Does not
He
describe the
painted signs
confession
for
she
department
heard or
stores
the
before
burden
the
she
war.
carried. Now
Does
he
not
painted
acknowledge
unit
the unique
insignia
trauma
of
of
understanding both sides
the
so
absurdity
completely
hadn't
that she
worn
could no
off.
longer believe in either. Around him,
Because
translation is invisible
silence,
words, inflating more translators tanks, disappear
positioning
behind
them
the words
information,
they convert,
draping
camouflage,
their
their
understanding
understanding facilitating
facilitates
communication for others, but
They
they
were
were artists
suspended
between
mostly.
the speakers. Fashion
They
designers,
become
conduits, Broadway set
vessels,
decorators, bridges that
men who
everyone
understood
crosses
shadow
without
and
acknowledging the
perspective
bridge and how the
itself.
human eye could be fooled. But bridges bear weight. The question nobody could
And
answer
some
was
bridges
whether German
collapse under
eyes could be
loads they were
fooled the
never
same
designed
way.
to carry.
Colonel Harry
The letters
Reeder walked
Marie-Thérèse
among the
left
inflatable behind
documents
document a truth
his
that
boots
historians
crunching
rarely
on gravel.
acknowledge, that wars
He
create
commanded real
casualties
armor
beyond
before
this
the
assignment. That
The
psychological
46th
armored
Armored
can be
Infantry
as
Regiment.
devastating as physical wounds.
Men
in steel and diesel
That
fuel.
understanding
can be more
Now he
destructive
commanded
than
rubber
ignorance.
and compressed air, and
Klaus
the slim
Weber's
hope that
letter to
visual
Marie-Thérèse
deception
described
described
her
her
understanding
warfare.
as making the unbearable
British
slightly
claimed
more
success
in North Africa. But her own letters
Dummy
suggest
tanks
the
had
opposite.
confused
Rommel at El Alamein. That her understanding made nothing
Fake
more
supply
bearable.
depots
had drawn German
That
bombers
empathy
away
for
from
both
real
sides
positions.
created
paralysis rather
But
than
North
insight.
Africa was desert.
That existing between
Open
languages
terrain.
meant existing between
Long
certain
sight lines.
and that space was ultimately
Normandy would be
unbearable.
different.
The
Villages.
translator's dilemma is this.
Hedgerows.
To accurately convey meaning
Germans who
requires
spent 4
understanding
years
the speaker's
preparing
perspective,
defenses,
studying every
when you
kilometer
understand
of
both
coastline,
sides in a
photographing
conflict,
from the
you
air
lose
daily.
the
comfortable distance that
If the
allows
deception
judgment.
looked fake, the
You see
operation
the humanity in everyone. If it looked too
And
real,
when everyone
German
is human,
artillery would
simple
target
moral
it, and
categories
Reeder's men had
collapse.
no armor, no heavy
Marie-Thérèse
weapons.
heard
German soldiers
just
confess their
imagination and
exhaustion
rubber
doubt.
tanks
that deflated when
punctured.
Heard Allied soldiers
The
confess
unit
their
had a
fear and
designation.
guilt.
Heard
20 civilians on both
headquarters
sides
special
described
troops.
the same displacement
The
and
men
hunger
called
and
it
desire
something
for the
else.
war to end. The ghost army.
And
in hearing all of it,
they'd
she
been accumulated
accumulated knowledge
knowledge
that
that
made the war simultaneously
No precedent.
justified and unjustifiable.
No
training manual. The cause was just. The U.S. Army had never
Fascism
created
had
a
to be
unit
defeated.
specifically designed for tactical
But the methods
deception.
were horrific.
George Washington
everyone
had used
participating
spies and
bore guilt
misinformation
regardless of which
which uniform they wore. But systematic
This
visual,
was what translation
sonic, and
taught
radio
her.
deception as doctrine.
This was what 3 years
They were
converting
inventing confessions from one language
Major
to another
Ralph
had
Ingersoll
revealed had pushed the concept. That war reduced everyone to the same
advertising
fundamental
executive in
humanity.
civilian
life. Now
That
assigned to
ideologies
military
mattered
intelligence
less than
and
London.
survival. He'd
That the
seen
distance
reconnaissance
between
photos
hero
from
and
British
criminal
deception
was often
operations,
just
circumstance and choice
studied
made
how
under
Rommel's
impossible
intelligence
pressure. officers have been
These
systematically
truths did
misled
not make
about
her
Allied
wise.
strength and positions. They made her isolated. If the British could do it in
Because
Africa,
wisdom requires
Americans could do
synthesis,
it in France,
and she could
find no synthesis. Save lives through illusion. Could not reconcile the contradictions. Make the enemy waste resources
Could not
attacking
convert
ghosts.
her
understanding into anything
Recruitment
except
had been
silence.
unusual.
The
They
academic
needed men
men
who
who
could think
in
like
1949
enemies,
anticipate
testimony
what observers
about
would
translation
believe, and empathy,
Artists
particularly
who
insightful.
understood
lighting. But insight
Sound
without
engineers who
resolution
could
is
fake
not
audio.
wisdom. It is just unmetabolized
mimic
knowledge that
communication
accumulates
patterns
like
so
toxins
precisely
that
that
German direction finding
Marie-Thérèse
units were
carried
carried
that
that
toxin
for 34 years after
The
the war
unit's
ended.
average
IQ measured
carried
119
confessions
from men who died or
higher
grew
than
old
most
while she
combat
remained
divisions.
suspended in the moment they confessed.
But
intelligence didn't guarantee
carried
survival.
understanding
that led nowhere except
Lieutenant
to
Colonel
recognition
Clifford
that some
Simmons
human
ran the
experiences
training.
cannot be translated
How to
into
inflate
meaning.
a dummy tank in
The
under
letters
20
she
minutes.
left behind are documents
How
of
to
that
create
impossibility.
tire
tracks that matched real
Attempts
armored
to
vehicles.
translate her own experience
How to
into
string
words that
radio
others might
antennas at heights
understand.
that suggested specific
But as
unit
she
herself noted, translation is always incomplete and act like soldiers
always
from
loses
divisions that
something in
didn't
the conversion
exist.
from one language to another.
Deception wasn't just visual. What was lost in her translations?
It was behavioral.
The fear
Every
that existed
detail had
beneath
to
the
align.
lines. German
guilt that
intelligence
colored every
officers were
confession.
professionals. The humanity
They
that made simple
cross-referenced
categories
signals
intercepts
impossible.
with aerial reconnaissance
And
with
what was
ground
lost in
reports.
attempting to translate her
One
experience for
inconsistency
others
could unravel everything.
the weight.
The equipment
burden of
arrived
carrying
throughout
hundreds of
February and
confessions.
March. The
Inflatable
psychological
tanks
exhaustion
on
of
Goodyear.
existing between two
Each Sherman
narratives and
replica
believing in
cost
neither.
$85.
These losses are
A real
permanent.
tank
cost $30,000. Cannot be recovered. The army
Cannot
cannot be
be
documented
documented
in ways that convey
They came
their
with
full
hand
impact.
pumps
initially, until
which
someone
means
realized
Marie-Thérèse
inflation
experience
took remains
remains
largely untranslatable.
Then compressors arrived.
Exists in archives
Portable
as
units
notation
mounted
rather
on
than
jeeps.
understanding. Loud enough
Preserved
to
as
operate
data
rather
rather
than
than
inflate
truth.
decoys far from
But
German
the letters
lines. exist. And in existing, they testify to a reality that deserves documentation even if it resists translation. That wars are fought not just by soldiers but by everyone who facilitates violence. That understanding can be as heavy as weapons. That some people carry burdens invisible to everyone else but no less real for their invisibility. Marie-Thérèse Marchand was the translator who heard confessions from both sides of the war. And what remains of her life is this, testimony to the weight of understanding. Documentation of the cost of existing between languages. Evidence that some experiences leave marks deeper than scars. The
May
lake in
3rd,
Geneva where she walked
1944.
every May 8th still reflects
Camp
the
Forest,
mountains, Tennessee. The streets she
The
traversed in her
canvas hissed
careful
as compressed
isolation
air
filled
filled
the
the
hollow
hollow
pedestrians who know nothing of
For
what she
men
witnessed.
guided
the inflation,
The
hands steadying
apartment
where
what
she
moments
died has
before
been
had been
occupied by
collapsed
new
heap of
residents who
rubberized
found
fabric
nothing
weighing
significant
less than
about its
100
previous
pounds.
tenant. In 90
But the
seconds,
letters remained.
it took shape. In a family
The turret
archive
rose
first, then the
in
hull,
languages that
then the
fewer
treads.
people
read. From 20
Confessions
feet away,
from a woman
it
who
looked translated
ridiculous.
confessions. A balloon. Documentation of
A toy.
experiences that resist documentation.
Something children might play with at a
and
county
perhaps
fair.
that is sufficient legacy. From 300 yards
Not
through
monuments
field
or
glasses,
ceremonies.
it looked like an M4
Not
Sherman
historical
tank.
recognition or
Private
academic
Daniel
analysis.
Tompkins stood watching,
Just
hands
letters.
shoved deep in his jacket
Proof
pockets.
that
someone carried the weight. He painted signs
That
for
someone
department
heard what
stores
others
before
said
in
in
moments of weakness and
Now
carried
he
those
painted
words
unit
forward even
insignia
when
on
carrying
rubber.
them became unbearable. The absurdity hadn't worn off. Marie-Thérèse Marchand translated
Around
truth
him,
from one
200
language
men
to
worked
another
in
for
practiced
3
silence,
years, inflating more
and what
tanks.
translation left
Positioning
behind
him was not
information,
wisdom or
draped in
insight or
camouflage
understanding
meant to
that could be
suggest crews
transmitted to
sleeping
others.
nearby.
What
They were
translation
artists,
left behind
mostly.
was simply this, evidence
Fashion
that the space
designers.
between languages is also
Broadway
a space
set
between
decorators.
certainties. Men
That
who
existing
understood
in that
shadow
space
and
requires
perspective
carrying
and how the human eye
contradictions.
could be fooled. That some
The
burdens
question
cannot
nobody
be shared
could answer
because
was
they
whether
exist
German
in a
eyes could
territory
be
too
fooled the same
specific
way.
to be communicated. Colonel Harry Reeder
She was the
walked among
bridge
the
that carried
inflatable
confessions
Shermans from both
his
sides,
boots
crunching on gravel. And when the confessions
He
became
commanded
too
real
heavy,
armor
the
before
bridge
this
did not
assignment.
collapse. The
It simply
46th
bore
Armored
the weight.
Infantry Regiment. Silently. Men in steel and diesel
Alone.
fuel. Until
Now
it could
he
bear no
commanded
more.
rubber and compressed air, and
That
the
is
slim
when
hope that
translation
visual
leaves
deception
behind.
might work in modern warfare.
The weight. The British
silence.
claimed success in North Africa. The testimony that some truths
Dummy
cannot
tanks
be
had
translated
confused
into
rubble at
anything
El
except
Alamein.
the recognition that
Fake
translation
supply
itself is
depots had
insufficient.
drawn
German bombers away
And in
from
that
real
insufficiency
positions lies the only honesty
North
available
Africa
to those
was
who
desert.
exist between worlds.
Open
Hearing
terrain.
confessions that neither side
Long
was
sight
knowledge and
lines.
carrying understanding that
Normandy
leads
would be
nowhere
different.
except to the recognition of its own
Villages.
limits. Hedgerows. Germans who'd spent 4 years preparing defenses, studying every kilometer of coastline, photographing from the air daily. If the deception looked fake, the operation failed. If it looked too real, German artillery would target it, and Reeder's men had no armor, no heavy weapons. Just imagination and rubber tanks that deflated when punctured. The unit had a designation. 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The men called it something else. The Ghost Army. They'd been activated in January. No precedent. No training manual. The U.S. Army had never created a unit specifically designed for tactical deception. George Washington had used spies and misinformation at Trenton. But systematic visual, sonic, and radio deception as doctrine? They were inventing it. Major Ralph Ingersoll had pushed the concept. An advertising executive in civilian life, now assigned to military intelligence in London. He'd seen reconnaissance photos from British deception operations. Studied how Rommel's intelligence officers had been systematically misled about Allied strength and positions. If the British could do it in Africa, Americans could do it in France. Save lives through illusion. Make the enemy waste resources attacking ghosts. Recruitment had been unusual. They needed men who could think like enemies, anticipate what observers would believe. Artists who understood lighting. Sound engineers who could fake audio. Radio operators who could mimic communication patterns so precisely that German direction-finding units would track phantom divisions. The unit's average IQ measured 119. Higher than most combat divisions. But intelligence didn't guarantee survival. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simmons ran the training. How to inflate a dummy tank in under 20 minutes. How to create tire tracks that matched real armored vehicles. How to string radio antennas at heights that suggested specific unit types. How to walk, talk, and act like soldiers from divisions that didn't exist. Deception wasn't just visual. It was behavioral. Every detail had to align. German intelligence officers were professionals. They cross-referenced signals intercepts with aerial reconnaissance with ground reports. One inconsistency could unravel everything. The equipment arrived throughout February and March. Inflatable tanks from Goodyear. Each Sherman replica cost $85. A real tank cost $30,000. The Army ordered hundreds. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized inflation took too long. Then compressors arrived. Portable units mounted on jeeps. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines.